So you disagree with Jordan Peterson. You should clean up your room. You like the rooms messy. It's essential for beauty.
It's not that. It's okay. I have no idea if it was intended this way, and so I'm just interpreting it a way I like. The commandment about having no false idols. To me, the way I interpret that is meaningful is that reality is sacred to me. I have a reverence for reality, but I know my best understanding of it is never complete. I know my best model of it is a model where I tried to make some kind of predictive capacity by reducing the complexity of it to a set of stuff that I could observe, and then a subset of that stuff that I thought was the causal dynamics, and then some set of mechanisms that are involved. And what we find is that it can be super useful. Like Newtonian gravity can help us do ballistic curves and all kinds of super useful stuff. And then we get to the place where it doesn't explain what's happening at the cosmological scale or at a quantum scale. And at each time, what we're finding is we excluded stuff. And it also doesn't explain the reconciliation of gravity with quantum mechanics and the other kind of fundamental laws. So models can be useful, but they're never true with a capital T, meaning they're never an actual, real, full, they're never a complete description of what's happening in real systems. They can be a complete description of what's happening in an artificial system that was the result of applying a model. So the model of a circuit board and the circuit board are the same thing. But I would argue that the model of a cell and the cell are not the same thing. And I would say this is key to what we call complexity versus the complicated, which is a distinction Dave Snowden made well in defining the difference between simple, complicated, complex, and chaotic systems. But one of the definers in complex systems is that no matter how you model the complex system, it will still have some emergent behavior not predicted by the model.
Can you elaborate on the complex versus the complicated?
Complicated means we can fully explicate the phase space of all the things that it can do. We can program it. All human, not all, for the most part, human-built things are complicated. They don't self-organize. They don't self-repair. They're not self-evolving, and we can make a blueprint for them.
For human systems?
For human technologies.
Human technologies. So sorry. Okay, so non
that are basically the application of models. Right? And engineering is kind of applied science. Science as the modeling process. But
humans are complex.
Complex stuff, with biological type stuff and sociological type stuff, it more has generator functions. And even those can't be fully explicated. Then it has, or our explication can't prove that it has closure of what would be in the unknown set, where we keep finding it's just the genome. Oh, well, now it's the genome and the epigenome, and then a recursive change on the epigenome because of the proteome, and then there's mitochondrial DNA, and then virus is affected, and right? So it's like we get overexcited when we think we found the thing.
So on Facebook, you know how you can list your relationship as complicated? It should actually say it's complex. That's the more accurate question. How hard is it to build a video game, like virtual reality game, where it is so real? Forget like ultra realistic to where you can't tell the difference, but like it's so nice that you just want to stay there. You just want to stay there and you don't want to come back. Do you think that's doable within our lifetime?
Within our lifetime, probably. Yeah. I eat healthy, I live long.
Does that make you sad that there will be like population of kids that basically spend 95%, 99% of their time in a virtual world?
Very, very hard question to answer. For certain people, it might be something that they really derive a lot of value out of, derive a lot of enjoyment and like happiness out of. And maybe the real world wasn't giving them that. That's why they did that. So maybe it is good for certain people.
So ultimately, if it maximizes happiness,
right? I think
judge.
Yeah, I think if it's making people happy, maybe it's okay. Again, I think this is a very hard question.
Well, do you think beliefs are in themselves can become reality? I mean, so you've now adapted in this little bit of a conversation, adapted the metaphysician view of reality, which is the physics.
Yes.
But, we humans kind of operate in the space of ideas, very much so. like we've kind of in the collective intelligence of human beings have come up with a set of ideas that persist in the minds of these many people, and they become quite strong and powerful. Like in terms of like impact on our lives, they can have sometimes more impact than this table does, than the physics.
Yeah, I agree.
And in that sense, is there some sense in which our beliefs are reality, even if they're not connected to the physics?
Yes, even if they're not real. Yeah, even if, okay. So yes, absolutely. So our beliefs are tremendously, they create social effects. Absolutely. There was a belief that, I'm going to use this example. There was a belief back in the day, and we're talking about, when I say back in the day, I'm a historian, so I'm talking about like 1,000 years ago, right? That women had no souls. Okay, so look, I don't know if human beings have souls. I can tell you this, though, that if human beings have souls, probably animals do too. That's my own personal belief. That's not a professor belief there. But there was this belief among the Catholic magisterium, which runs Europe, that women had no souls. So they had to have this big meeting about it. You know, did women have souls? But that belief had consequences for women. I mean, women were treated and have been treated as if they didn't have souls. Okay, so there's,
and the soul was really the essence of the human being.
It was. It's called the animus, right? It's what is the essence of what is. It's eternal. You know, when women were eternal. Here's another example. Okay, this is an example from my own research. All right, so there in the Catholic tradition, there's this idea of purgatory, hell, and heaven, and these are three destinations that people can go to when they die, and if you're great, you go to heaven automatically and you're considered a saint. If you're okay, you go to purgatory, right? And you suffer for a time and then get back into heaven. If you're terrible, you go to hell, right? Okay. Yep. Well, there was a place that the Catholics determined, and this was a belief for a long time, like 1,000 years or more. And it was called limbo, all right? And limbo comes from the Latin limbus, and it means edge. And it was either on the edge of hell or on the edge of heaven. No one really could determine which it was. No historians are like, well, this person says it was on the edge of heaven. Well, listen, this was a terrible, first of all, there is no limbo anymore. In 2007, Benedict, the then Pope, got rid of the idea that there was limbo. Okay, so Catholics kind of went crazy because they didn't really know. They forgot that limbo existed and they thought it was purgatory. Yeah. And they said, how could you get rid of purgatory? But actually, he just got rid of this idea of limbo.
Oh, so that's a distinct thing from purgatory.
It was.
And by the way, people should know they have a book on purgatory that came before
American Cosmic. Yes, I wrote a book on purgatory. Yeah.
Anyway, so limbo is a distinct thing from purgatory.
Yeah, and the types of people who go to limbo happen to be virtuous pagans. Okay, like Socrates or somebody like that, and children who weren't baptized. So think of this. Think of for like more than 1,000 years, mothers and fathers gave birth to babies who weren't baptized and couldn't be buried with their family in these burial. And, you know, they couldn't be reunited with them in heaven. Think of the pain and suffering that caused. And that was nothing. Yeah. Limbo's nothing. Yet the belief in it caused untold suffering. And that's just a small example.
And that was as real to them.
It was absolutely real. I mean, the effects were real. Let's put it that way. The place itself, not real.
But the families themselves, do you think they really believed it?
They totally believed it.
As much as the table is real?
Yes. I've read, but listen, we have trigger warnings today, right? So don't read this. It's going to make you upset, okay? Yeah. History, primary sources, no trigger warnings, okay? Yeah. So you're going through, like, you know, somebody's diary from 1400 and you hear the suffering and pain that they went through. There were times in my research where I'd have to put my primary source down, you know, and just basically go outside and take a walk because it was so horrific. I knew it was true because they wouldn't write something, you know, they're not going to write in their diary something that's not true. And it was horrible. So yes, these people went through untold suffering for nothing, for, you know, because they had an erroneous belief, but they didn't know it was erroneous.
So it was real to them.
Yeah.
Predictive.
Do you have a sense of what is that base layer physical reality? You have so you have these attempts at the theories of everything, the very, very small of like string theory or what Stephen Wolfram talks about with a hypergrass. These are these tiny, 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 tiny objects. And then there is more like quantum mechanics that's talking about objects that are much larger, but still very, very, very tiny. Do you have a sense of where the tiniest thing is that is like at the lowest level? The turtle at the very bottom. Do you have a sense?
I don't think that you can talk about where it is, because space is emergent over the activity of these things. So space, the coordinates only exist in relation to the other things. And so you could, in some sense, abstract it into locations that can hold information and trajectories that the information can take between the different locations. And this is how we construct our notion of space.
Yeah.
And physicists usually have a notion of space that is continuous. And this is a point where I tend to agree with people like Stephen Wolfram, who are very skeptical of the geometric notions. I think that geometry is the dynamics of too many parts to count. And when there are no infinities, if there were two infinities, you would be running into contradictions, which is in some sense what Gödel and Turing discovered in response to Hilbert's call. So
there are no infinities.
There are no infinities.
Infinity is fake.
There is unboundedness, but if you have a language that talks about infinity, at some point the language is going to contradict itself, which means it's no longer valid. In order to deal with infinities in mathematics, you have to postulate their existence initially. You cannot construct the infinities. And that's an issue, right? You cannot build up an infinity from zero. But in practice, you never do this, right? When you perform calculations, you only look at the dynamics of too many parts to count. And usually these numbers are not that large. They're not Googles or something. The infinities that we are dealing with in our universe are, mathematically speaking, relatively small integers. And still, what we're looking at is dynamics where a trillion things behave similar to 100 trillion things, or something that is very, very large, because they're converging.
Yeah.
And these convergent dynamics, these operators, this is what we deal with when we are doing the geometry. Right? Geometry is stuff where we can pretend that it's continuous, because if we subdivide the space sufficiently fine-grained, these things approach a certain dynamic. And this approached dynamic, that is what we mean by it. But I don't think that infinity would work, so to speak, that you would know the last digit of pi, and that you have a physical process that rests on knowing the last digit of pi.
Yeah, that could be just a peculiar quirk of human cognition, that we like discrete. Discrete makes sense to us. Infinity doesn't. So in terms of our intuitions.
No, the issue is that everything that we think about needs to be expressed in some kind of mental language. Not necessarily a natural language, but some kind of mathematical language that your neurons can speak, that refers to something in the world. And what we have discovered is that we cannot construct a notion of infinity without running into contradictions, which means that such a language is no longer valid. And I suspect this is what made Pythagoras so unhappy when somebody came up with the notion of irrational numbers before it was time, right? There's this myth that he had this person killed when he blabbed out the secret that not everything can be expressed as a ratio between two numbers, but there are numbers between the ratios. The world was not ready for this. And I think he was right. That has confused mathematicians very seriously, because these numbers are not values, they are functions. Right, so you can calculate these functions to a certain degree of approximation, but you cannot pretend that pi has actually a value. Pi is a function that would approach this value to some degree. But nothing in the world rests on knowing pi.
How important is this distinction between discrete and continuous for you to get to the... Because there's in discussion of your favorite flavor of the theory of everything, there's a few on the table. So there's string theory, there's loop quantum gravity, which focus on one particular unification. There's just a bunch of favorite flavors of different people trying to propose a theory of everything. Eric Weinstein and a bunch of people throughout history. And then, of course, Stephen Wolfram, who I think is one of the only people doing a discrete theory.
No, there's a bunch of physicists who do this right now. And Toffoli and Tomasello, and digital physics is something that is, I think, growing in popularity. But the main reason why this is interesting is because it's important sometimes to settle disagreements. I don't think that you need infinities at all, and you never needed them. You can always deal with very large numbers, and you can deal with limits, right? We are fine with doing that. You don't need any kind of infinity. You can build your computer algebra systems just as well without believing in infinity in the first place.
So you're okay with limits?
Yeah. So basically, a limit means that something is behaving pretty much the same if you make the number larger, right? Because it's converging to a certain value, and at some point, the difference becomes negligible, and you can no longer measure it. And in this sense, you have things that if you have an n-gon which has enough corners, then it's going to behave like a circle at some point, right? And it's only going to be in some kind of esoteric thing that cannot exist in a physical universe that you would be talking about this perfect circle. And now it turns out that it also wouldn't work in mathematics, because you cannot construct mathematics that has infinite resolution without running into contradictions. So that is itself not that important, because we never did that, right? It's just a thing that some people thought we could. And this leads to confusion. So, for instance, Roger Penrose uses this as an argument to say that there are certain things that mathematicians can do, dealing with infinities, and by extension, our mind can do, that computers cannot do.
Yeah, he talks about that there's the human mind can do certain mathematical things that the computer, as defined by the universal Turing machine, cannot.
Yes.
So that it has to do with infinity.
Yes, it's one of the things. So he is basically pointing at the fact that there are things that are possible in the mathematical mind and in pure mathematics that are not possible in machines that can be constructed in the physical universe. And because he's an honest guy, he thinks this means that present physics cannot explain operations that happen in our mind.
Do you think he's right on the... So let's leave his discussion of consciousness aside for the moment. Do you think he's right about just what he's basically referring to as intelligence? So is the human mind fundamentally more capable as a thinking machine than a universal Turing machine?
No.
But so he's suggesting that, right?
So our mind is actually less than a Turing machine. There can be no Turing machine because it's defined as having an infinite tape. And we always only have a finite tape.
But he's saying it's better. Our minds can only
perform finitely many operations. Yes, I think so.
It can do the kind of computation that the Turing machine cannot.
And that's because he thinks that our minds can do operations that have infinite resolution in some sense. And I don't think that's the case. Our minds are just able to discover these limit operators over too many parts to count.
What about his idea that consciousness is more than a computation? So it's more than something that a Turing machine can do. So again, saying that there's something special about our mind that cannot be replicated in the machine.
The issue is that I don't even know how to construct a language to express this statement correctly.
Well, the basic statement is there's a human experience that includes intelligence, that includes self-awareness, that includes the hard problem of consciousness. And the question is, can that be fully simulated in the computer, in the mathematical model of the computer as we understand it today? Roger Penrose says no. So the universal Turing machine cannot simulate the universe.
So the interesting question is, and you have to ask him this, is why not? What is the specific thing that cannot be modeled? And when I looked at his writings, and I haven't read all of it, but when I read, for instance, the section that he writes in the introduction to A Road to Infinity, the thing that he specifically refers to is the way in which human minds deal with infinities. And that itself can, I think, easily be deconstructed. A lot of people feel that our experience cannot be explained in a mechanical way. And therefore, it needs to be different. And I concur. Our experience is not mechanical. Our experience is simulated. It exists only in a simulation. Only a simulation can be conscious. Physical systems cannot be conscious because they're only mechanical. Cells cannot be conscious. Neurons cannot be conscious. Brains cannot be conscious. People cannot be conscious as far as if you understand them as physical systems. What can be conscious is the story of a system in the world where you write all these things into the story. You have experiences for the same reason that a character in a novel has experiences, because it's written into the story. And now the system is acting on that story. And it's not a story that is written in a natural language. It's written in a perceptual language, in this multimedia language of the game engine. And in there, you write in what kind of experience you have and what this means for the behavior of the system, for your behavior tendencies, for your focus, for your attention, for your experience of valence, and so on. And this is being used to inform the behavior of the system in the next step. And then the story updates with the reactions of the system and the changes in the world and so on. And you live inside of that model. You don't live inside of the physical reality.
And I mean, just to linger on it, like you see, okay, it's in the perceptual language, the multimodal perceptual language. That's the experience. That's what consciousness is within that model, within that story. But do you have agency? When you play a video game, you can turn left and you can turn right in that story. So in that dream world, how much control do you have? Is there such a thing as you in that story? Like, is it right to say the main character? You know, everybody's NPCs, and then there's the main character, and you're controlling the main character. Or is that an illusion? Is there a main character that you're controlling? I'm getting to the point of like the free will point.
Imagine that you are building a robot that plays soccer.
Yeah.
And you've been to MIT computer science. You basically know how to do that. Right. And so you would say the robot is an agent that solves a control problem. How to get the ball into the goal. And it needs to perceive the world, and the world is disturbing him in trying to do this, right? So he has to control many variables to make that happen, and to project itself and the ball into the future, and understand its position on the field relative to the ball, and so on, in the position of its limbs or in the space around it, and so on. So it needs to have an adequate model that abstracting reality in a useful way. And you could say that this robot does have agency over what it's doing in some sense. And the model is going to be a control model. And inside of that control model, you can possibly get to a point where this thing is sufficiently abstract to discover its own agency. Our current robots don't do that. They don't have a unified model of the universe. But there's not a reason why we shouldn't be getting there at some point in the not too distant future. And once that happens, you will notice that the robot tells a story about a robot playing soccer. So the robot will experience itself playing soccer in a simulation of the world that it uses to construct a model of the locations of its legs and limbs in space on the field with relationship to the ball. And it's not going to be at the level of the molecules. It will be an abstraction that is exactly at the level that is most suitable for past planning of the movements of the robot. Right? It's going to be a high-level abstraction, but a very useful one that is as predictive as we can make it. And in that side of that story, there is a model of the agency of that system. So this model can accurately predict that the contents of the model are going to be driving the behavior of the robot in the immediate future.
But there's the hard problem of consciousness, which I would also, there's a subjective experience of free will as well, that I'm not sure where the robot gets that, where that little leap is. Because for me right now, everything I imagine with that robot, as it gets more and more and more sophisticated, the agency comes from the programmer of the robot still, of what was programmed in.
You could probably do an end-to-end learning system. You maybe need to give it a few priors, so you nudge the architecture in the right direction that it converges more quickly. But ultimately, discovering the suitable hyperparameters of the architecture is also only a search process, right? And as the search process was evolution, that has informed our brain architecture so we can converge in a single lifetime on useful interaction with the world and the formation of a self.
The problem is if we define hyperparameters broadly, so it's not just the parameters that control this end-to-end learning system, but the entirety of the design of the robot. Like there's you have to remove the human completely from the picture, and then in order to build the robot, you have to create an entire universe, because you can't just shortcut evolution. You have to go from the very beginning in order for it to have, because I feel like there's always a human pulling the strings, and that makes it seem like the robot is cheating. It's getting a shortcut to consciousness.
When you are looking at the current Boston Dynamics robots, it doesn't look as if there is somebody pulling the strings. It doesn't look like cheating.
I have to ask about, there's a million things I can ask you about, but virtual reality, I got to ask you. You've thought about virtual reality, mixed reality, quite a bit. What are the interesting trajectories you see for the proliferation of virtual reality or mixed reality in the next
so I was
years?
I was at Magic Leap for 5 years.
With the best title of all time.
Oh, thanks. Chief Futurist.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I sort of had a little squad of people in Seattle doing what you might call content R&D. So we're trying to make content for AR, but because it's such a new medium, it's more of an engineering R&D project almost than a creative project. So it was fascinating to see everything that goes into making an AR system that runs. So an AR device, if it's really going to do AR, needs to be running SLAM in real time. And that alone is a big...
So for people who don't know, first of all, virtual reality is creating an almost fully artificial world and putting you inside it. Augmented reality, AR, is taking the real world and putting stuff on top of that real world. And when you say SLAM, that means in real time, the device needs to be able to sense, accurately detect everything about that world sufficiently to be able to reconstruct it, the 3D structure of it, so you can put stuff on top of it. And doing that in real time, presumably not just real time, but in a way that creates a pleasant experience for the human perception system, is that's an engineering project.
Right. Yeah, well said. And it's just one of the things that the system has to do. It's also tracking your eyes, so it knows what you're looking at, how far away what you're looking at is. It's performing all those functions, and it's got to keep doing that without, burning up the CPU or depleting the battery unreasonably fast. And that's just table stakes. It's just the basic functions of the operating system. And then any content that you want to add has to sit on top of that. It's got to be rendered by the optics at a sufficiently low latency that it looks real and you don't get sick. So it's an amazing thing. And, Magic Leap shipped a device that can do that in 2019. And they're about to ship the ML2. Mm-hmm. But I don't know any more about that than anyone else because I don't work there anymore.
Does it still, to some degree, boil down to a killer app, a content question? Like you said, it's kind of a wide open space. Nobody knows exactly what's going to be the compelling thing.
Yeah.
So doesn't a super compelling experience of some sort alleviate some of the need for engineering perfection?
Well, there's a base layer of engineering that you have to have no matter what. But you're certainly right that people, like in the early days of video games, put up with kind of low frame rate and what we would now call crappy graphics because they were having so much fun playing Doom or whatever.
Right. Even Tetris.
Yeah. So for sure that's true. And so, I was working on consumer-facing content. There was a great team in Wellington, New Zealand, that made a game called Dr. Groydbrot's Invaders that realized the potential of AR gaming in a way that I don't think anything else has before or since. So that was definitely the strategy until April 2020, which is when the company decided to pivot to commercial industrial applications instead. I haven't seen their financial projections, but I assume they had good reasons for making that strategic decision. It just means that it's no longer necessarily targeted at just end users who want to play a game or be entertained, but it's,
That to me, from a sort of a dreamer, futurist perspective, is heartbreaking because I don't know necessarily from in the VR space, but I see this kind of thing with robotics, where to me the future of robotics is consumer facing, and a lot of great roboticists, Boston Dynamics and companies like that, are focused on sort of industrial applications.
Yeah.
Because for financial business reasons.
Yeah. No, I can see the parallels for sure. We'll see. It was a fun project. We worked on an app, for example, called Baby Goats, which just populated your room with baby goats.
That seems like a killer app right there.
Well, we thought highly of the idea for sure.
Yes.
But because of the slam, the system knew, for example, here's a table, here's a little end table. We know the heights. We know how high our animated baby goat can jump. So our engineers had to build a system for converting the SLAM primitives into game engine objects that the game the AIs in the game could navigate around. And that ended up shipping as more of a dev kit or a sort of a sample app than as a finished consumer facing.
You mean the Baby Goat AI? Yeah.
Yeah.
That seems to me like a world I could entertain myself for hours, just every day coming home to see baby goats.
Yeah. I mean, it was an ambient kind of, it's not a thing that you would sit there and play like a video.
Just life.
Yeah. Yeah.
But now there's baby goats. I mean, what's the purpose of having dogs and cats?
Right.
In your life? Exactly. Right. It's kind of ambient.
Yeah.
They're not really helping you do anything, but it's enriching your life.
And you can go and play fetch or something for a while if you want, but you don't have to.
Right.
Yeah. So we worked on that and a bigger project that was more of a storytelling in a fictional universe. The hardware is worth a look. There's still a belief, I just saw it this morning looking at Twitter, that the Magic Leap never shipped anything. But they've been, since 2019, you can go to their website and buy one of these devices anytime you want to spend the money.
Yeah. And the new one is coming out, I think, in 2022, so in a few months. What do you think, looking out 50 years from now, what wins? Virtual reality, augmented reality, or physical reality?
What wins?
Meaning, like, what's what do people that have financial resources enjoy spending most of their time in?
Mm-hmm. I've always been a fan of AR, and it's kind of an easy answer because if you're wearing an AR device, you put a bag over your head, it becomes a VR device. If you block out what's really there, then all you're seeing is a VR.
But you are with AR constrained to kind of operate in something that's similar to physical reality.
Yeah.
With VR, you can go into fantastical worlds.
True. So there are still issues in those fantastical worlds with motion sickness, right? So if your body is experiencing acceleration, your inner ear, that differs from what your eye thinks it's seeing, then you'll get sick, unless you're a very unusual person. So it doesn't mean you can't do it. It's a constraint that VR designers have to learn to work with.
So do you think it's possible that in the future we're living mostly in a virtual reality world? Like we become more and more detached from physical reality?
For entertainment, maybe. For certain applications, I'm personally more. We have to make a distinction between what I would personally find interesting and what might win in the market. So maybe some people, maybe lots of people, would like to spend a huge amount of time in VR. I'm personally more interested in enhancing the experience that I have of the physical world, because the physical world's pretty cool, right? There's a lot to be said for moving around in the real world. And
can I ask you, for you personally, to try to play devil's advocate, or to try to imagine a VR world where you and Neal Stephenson wouldn't want to stay? Not because the physical world all of a sudden became really bad for some reason, like you're trying to escape it.
Yeah.
But like literally, it's just more enriching in the same way. Like there's a glimmer in your eye when you said you enjoy the physical world. Like double up on that glimmer for the virtual reality. Can you imagine such a world? Well,
like I'll give maybe an example that's a bridge, which is that I like making things. So I like working in a machine shop and making objects with 3D printers or machines or whatever. And so I've had to learn how to get good at using a CAD program. There's many to choose from. I use one called Fusion 360. And I can spend hours in that trying to imagine and create the things I want to create. And it's not virtual reality exactly, but that whole time my whole field of view is occupied by this monitor that's showing me a window into a three-dimensional space. I'm rotating things around. I'm imagining things. I'm making things. And so that is, pretty close to being in virtual reality.
Does that thing have to exist for you to experience true joy? Can you stay in Fusion 360 the whole time? Do you have to 3D print it and touch it?
Yeah, that's my game. That's what I'm up to. But it happens that if you're building a virtual environment, if you're making a game level or creating a virtual set for a film or TV production, the thing that you're designing in the program may never physically exist. And in fact, it's preferable that it doesn't, because the whole point of that is to make imaginary things that you couldn't build otherwise. So I think lots of people spend a good chunk of their working hours in something that's pretty close to VR. It's just that currently the output device happens to be a rectangular object in front of them. You could replace that with a VR headset and they'd be doing the same stuff.
There's all kinds of interfaces. For example, I enjoy listening to podcasts or audiobooks, but let's say actually podcasts, because there's intimate human connection in a podcast. It's one way, but you get to learn about the person you're listening to. And that's a real connection. And that's just audio. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people, that's just audio.
True.
And like for me, that's just audio. As a fan of people, and you kind of a little bit are friends with those people.
Yeah. They're in your life. You're listening to them. Yeah.
And they're as far away from real as he gets. There's not even
Yeah.
There's not even a visual component. It's just audio, but they're as real. Like if I was on a desert island, like my imagination, like this thing works pretty good in terms of imagination. Like that, it creates a very beautiful world with just audio. So I mean,
or even just reading books.
Yeah, exactly. Reading books.
Yeah,
even more so with reading books, because there's certain mediums which stimulate the imagination more.
Mm-hmm.
When you present less, the imagination works more, and that can create really enriching experiences. So I mean, to me, the question is, can you do some of the amazing things that make life amazing in virtual worlds? It seems to me the answer there is obviously yes. Even if I, like you, am attached to a lot of stuff in the physical world, I think I can very readily imagine coming up with some of the same magical experiences in the virtual world, where you make friends and you can fall in love, where the source of love in your life is to a much greater degree inside of a virtual world. And then love means fulfillment, that means happiness, that's the thing you look forward to, and not some kind of dopamine rush type of love, but like long lasting, like friendship.
The real deal. Yeah. It just depends on what is there in the way of applications, the content, and can it feed you those things? Can it give you, like in my example of using the CAD program, it gives me the ability to do something I enjoy, which is imagining things and making things in a particular way.
But can we psychoanalyze you for a second?
Sure.
What exactly do you enjoy? Is there some component of you building the thing where you get to at least a little bit share with others? Like, is there a human in the loop outside of you in that picture?
Will anyone ever see it?
Right. Like, there's a source of your enjoyment, because I would argue that perhaps when like the turtles all the way down, when you get to the bottom turtle, it has to do with sharing it with other humans.
Yeah.
And if you can then put those humans inside the VR world, then you start to then you can, okay, for example, you could do it in the physical world, the 3D printing, but you share it in the virtual world, and that's where the source of happiness is.
I think, at least speaking for myself, I'm always thinking in terms of an audience, and at some level, I feel like I'm doing this for someone or communicating to someone, even if there's not a specific someone in mind. Yeah. It could just be an abstract, theoretical someone. And like another app I spend a lot of time in is Mathematica. Okay, and when I do
incredible app.
Yeah. And when I do a Mathematica notebook, if I'm trying to figure something out, I spend a lot of time typing. Just my stuff is just huge blocks of text, just me thinking out loud, and then some graphs and calculations and stuff. Because to me, that act of explaining things and commenting helps me understand what I'm doing.
And there's kind of an audience, amorphous audience in mind.
Yeah, most of this stuff nobody will ever see, and yet I'm creating it as if there were an audience that might read this stuff. Because that's a necessary constraint that helps me do a better job.
What's this might be a tricky question to answer. What's comes to mind as a particularly beautiful thing that you're proud of that you created inside Mathematica, visualization-wise, or something that just comes to memory, if it's possible to retrieve?
So the thing I've spent the most amount of time on is I got obsessed a long time ago with trying to tile the globe with hexagons.
Yes.
And
actual globe?
Well, any spherical
okay.
object, but with an eye towards putting it on the earth. And so and have it be recursive. So you can have hexagons within hexagons, which is hard and probably a bad idea, because you can't tile a hexagon with smaller hexagons. They stick out.
Got it. So they stick out. So can you do some kind of fractal hexagon situation?
Yeah. So it's that, and people who know me are always now make fun of me for this. So they'll send me, if they see a picture with hexagons in it, they'll like send me a link, to make fun of me. So some
one of those people, Roger Penrose, or
I think Roger's a little above my level.
Well, he's into hexagons as well, and tiling.
Yeah. So I did a lot of that, and I thought, it was pretty cool. But there's some like surprisingly intractable problems that keep coming up. Like you've always got to have some pentagons. Like if you start with the icosahedron, which is equilateral triangles, which is a logical place to start, you can cover those with hexagons, but every vertex where the triangles come together is a pentagon, has to be a pentagon.
Oh, interesting. So it's all hexagons, and then there's a pentagon at the intersections.
Yeah.
Cool. How'd you figure that out? Is that a known fact?
Well, it's just if you look at like just by inspection.
It's an obvious thing. Got it.
Yeah. So you can't make that go away. So any system that you come up with to do this has got to have this exceptions built into it for those 12. You could have quintillions of hexagons, but you've still got to have 12 pentagons somewhere. So I've blown a hell of a lot of time on that over the years.
By the way, a lot of those kind of problems are very difficult to prove something about.
Yeah. And I think Uber did it because one of my friends who knows of my interest in this and who likes to give me a hard time sent me a link. This is a couple of years ago, to some code base that I think came out of Uber, where they had done this. You break down the whole surface of the Earth into little hexagons. So that was a real knife through the heart. But I'll probably come back to it someday.
Is there something special about hexagons, or are you interested in all kinds of tiling?
I'm interested in all kinds of tiling, but I'm not. I know my limitations, like as a math guy. So hexagons are about my speed.
Just sufficient amount of complexity.
Yeah. So, but no, tiling is a really interesting problem, both 2 and 3-dimensional. Tiling problems are fascinating, and they're one of those ancient puzzles that has attracted brainiacs for centuries.
You write about modeling of mathematical cognition. So let me first ask about mathematics in general. There's a paper titled Parallel Distributed Processing Approach to Mathematical Cognition, where in the introduction there's some beautiful discussion of mathematics. And you reference there Tristan Needham, who criticizes a narrow formal view of mathematics by likening the studying of mathematics as symbol manipulation to studying music without ever hearing a note. So, from that perspective, what do you think is mathematics? What is this world of mathematics like?
Well, I think of mathematics as a set of tools for exploring idealized worlds that often turn out to be extremely relevant to the real world, but need not. But they're worlds in which objects exist with idealized properties, and in which the relationships among them can be characterized with precision so as to allow the implications of certain facts to then allow you to derive other facts with certainty. So, if you have two triangles and you know that there is an angle in the first one that has the same measure as an angle in the second one, and you know that the lengths of the sides adjacent to that angle in each of the two triangles, the corresponding sides adjacent to that angle also have the same measure. Then you can then conclude that the triangles are congruent. That is to say, they have all of their properties in common. And that is something about triangles. It's not a matter of formulas. These are idealized objects. In fact, we build bridges out of triangles, and we understand how to measure the height of something we can't climb by extending these ideas about triangles a little further. And, all of the ability to get a tiny speck of matter launched from the planet Earth to intersect with some tiny, tiny little body way beyond Pluto somewhere at exactly a predicted time and date is something that depends on these ideas, right? So, and it's actually happening in the real physical world that these ideas make contact with it in those kinds of instances. But there are these idealized objects, these triangles or these distances or these points, whatever they are, that allow for this set of tools to be created that then gives human beings it's this incredible leverage that they didn't have without these concepts. And I think this is actually already true when we think about just, the natural numbers. I always like to include zero, so I'm going to say the non-negative integers, but that's a place where some people prefer not to include zero. But
no, we like zero here. So natural numbers 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on.
Yeah, and because they give you the ability to be exact about like how many sheep you have. Like, I sent you out this morning, there were 23 sheep. You came back with only 22. What happened? Yeah. Right?
The fundamental problem of physics, how many sheep you have. Yeah.
It's a fundamental problem of
life,
of human society, that you damn well better bring back the same number of sheep as you started with. And, it allows commerce, it allows contracts, it allows the establishment of records and so on, to have systems that allow these things to be notated. But they have an inherent aboutness to them that's at the one and the same time sort of abstract and idealized and generalizable, while on the other hand, potentially very, very grounded and concrete. And one of the things that makes for the incredible achievements of the human mind is the fact that humans invented these idealized systems that leverage the power of human thought in such a way as to allow all this kind of thing to happen. And so that's what mathematics to me is the development of systems for thinking about the properties and relations among sets of idealized objects and the mathematical notation system that we unfortunately focus way too much on is just our way of expressing propositions about these properties.
Right. It's just like we're talking with Chomsky in language. It's the thing we've invented for the communication of those ideas. They're not necessarily the deep representation of those ideas.
Yeah.
So what, well, from a psychology and from a neuroscience perspective, this whole construction that you've developed is fascinating. We did this a little bit with autonomous vehicles. So to try to understand the decision-making process of a pedestrian when they cross the road and trying to create an experience of a car, that can run you over. So there's the danger of there. I was so surprised how real that whole world was. And the graphics that we built wasn't ultra realistic or anything, but I was still afraid of being hit by a car. Everybody we tested were really afraid of being hit by that car.
Even though it was all a simulation.
It was all a simulation. It was kind of boxy, actually. I mean, it wasn't like ultra realistic simulation. And it's fascinating.
Looms and heights. So any kind of depth, we're just programmed to not necessarily recoil, but to be cautious about that edge and that depth. And then looms, things coming at us that are getting larger. There are looming sensing neurons even in the retina at a very, very early stage of visual processing. And incidentally, the way Muller and folks learned how to not get eaten by great white sharks when you're swimming outside the cage is as they start lumbering in, you swim toward them. And they get very confused when you loom on them because clearly you're smaller. Clearly they could eat you if they wanted to. But there's something about forward movement toward any creature that creature questions whether or not it would be a good idea to generate forward movement toward you. And so that's actually the survival tool of these cage exit white shark divers.
Are you playing around with, like, one of the critical things for the autonomous vehicle research is you couldn't do 360 video because there's a game theoretic, there's an interactive element that's really necessary. So maybe people realize this, maybe they don't, but 360 video, you obviously, well, it's actually not that obvious to people, but you can't change the reality that you're watching.
That's right.
So, but you find that's like, is there something fundamental about fear and stress that the interactive element is essential for? Or do you find you can arouse people with just the video?
Great question. It works best to use mixed reality. So we have a snake stimulus. I personally don't like snakes at all. I don't mind spiders. We also have a spider stimulus, but like snakes, I just don't like them. There's something about the slithering and it creates a visceral response for me. Some people not so much, and they have lower levels of stress and fear in there. But one way that we can get them to feel more of that is to use mixed reality, where we have an actual physical bat and they have to stomp out the snake as opposed to just walk to a little safe corner, which then makes the snake disappear. That tends to be not as stressful as if they have a physical weapon. And so you got people in there, banging on the floor against this thing. And there's something about engaging that makes it more of a threat. Now, I should also mention, we always get the subjective report from the subject of what they experience, because we never want to project our own ideas about what they were feeling. But that's the beauty of working with humans, is you can ask them how they feel.
Exactly.
And humans aren't great at explaining how they feel, but it's a lot easier to understand what they're saying than a mouse or a macaque monkey is saying. So it's the best we can do is language plus these physiological and neurophysiological.
How can geometry in ancient times or today be used to understand reality? And maybe how do you think about geometry as a distinct tool in mathematics and physics?
Yes, geometry is my favorite part of math as well. And Greeks were enamored by geometry. They tried to describe physical reality using geometry and principles of geometry and symmetry. Platonic solids, the 5 solids they had discovered, had these beautiful solids. They thought it must be good for some reality. There must be explaining something. They attached, one to air, one to fire, and so forth. So they tried to give physical reality to symmetric objects. Mm-hmm. These symmetric objects are symmetries of rotation, and discrete symmetry groups we call today of rotation group in 3 dimensions. Now, we kind of laugh at the way they were trying to connect that symmetry to, the laws of the realities of physics. But actually, it turns out in modern days, we use symmetries in not too far away, exactly in these kind of thoughts processes in the following way. In the context of string theory, which is the field I study, we have these extra dimensions. And these extra dimensions are compact, tiny spaces typically, but they have different shapes and sizes. We have learned that if these extra shapes and sizes have symmetries, which are related to the same rotation symmetries that the Greek were talking about, if they enjoy those discrete symmetries, and if you take that symmetry and quotient the space by it, in other words, identify points under these symmetries, you get properties of that space at the singular points, which force emanates from them. What forces? Forces like the ones we have seen in nature today, like electric forces, like strong forces, like weak forces. So these same principles that were driving them to connect geometry and symmetries to nature is driving today's physics. Now much more, modern ideas, but nevertheless, the symmetries connecting geometry to physics. In fact, often sometimes we ask the following question. Suppose I want to get this particular, physical reality. I want to have these particles with these forces and so on. What do I do? It turns out that you can geometrically design the space to give you that. You say, I would put the sphere here. I would do this. I would shrink them. So if you have 2 spheres touching each other and shrinking to 0 size, that gives you strong forces. If you have one of them, it gives you the weak forces. If you have this, you get that. And if you want to unify forces, do the other thing. So these geometrical translation of physics is one of my favorite things that we have discovered in modern physics in the context of string theory.
The sad thing is when you go into multiple dimensions, and we'll talk about it, is we start to lose our capacity to visually intuit the world we're discussing. And then we go into the realm of mathematics and we lose that. Unfortunately, our brains are such that we're limited. But
yes, right? Like you and Eric, you've done 3, I think, with Eric?
Yeah, we have 4. I haven't released the 4th yet.
Oh, okay. So I watched all 3 because I really thought your Yu way and him like giving you advice was very interesting dynamic. I thought it was very interesting dynamic. And I find him like a fascinating cat. Yeah. We know everybody in common except we've never met. It's very weird because, you think about the social graph in the real world. This is why I think augmented reality is going to be such an amazing product. I just have one killer feature I want for augmented reality. We wear our glasses, and when I look at you above your head, I see the relationships we have and the things we've done together.
Yes.
Right? So I see, you both know Sam Harris, or you had Elon on the podcast on this date, or you and I were both at Burning Man in 2016.
So like the most meaningful element of our connection in the network. Yeah.
And then, because we would discover that through small talk, but imagine you're like at a party and you look and people glow. And you just see a glow around a person, and like green means you have some financial relationship, blue means you have some friendship one, or yellow means you have friendship one, blue means you know nothing about each other. You have no connections. You're like, wow, these blue people I have no connection to. Yeah. These people, that one's glowing red. We know 7 or more people in common. Yeah. And those are the 7 people. Oh, we should go talk about how we know each other.
Yeah.
That could, and that sort of happened with Facebook, remember, or MySpace, where you were like, oh, you know that person, friend of a friend? Yeah. But that's what is going to be AR's like. This is why I think if Apple figures out AR or Snapchat and they just have those glasses, forget about VR. It's just nauseating and whatever. But AR, where you put the glasses on, you see the real world, but you augment it.
You make, just like you were saying, you make it frictionless, a very low friction to make a deep human connection, because you have all the basic elements there already.
Now think about the unintended consequences of what I just described. It could get creepy and weird.
The privacy thing.
I mean, people will opt. Here's the thing. Your privacy is an illusion. Like, all this information is there. And then people are more than willing to give up privacy in exchange for some value. It's a value trade.
Yeah.
And giving, if my Tesla, when I'm driving in the direction of my house, just starts the navigation and saves me 3 clicks and that friction's gone, I'm willing to give Tesla my location and my home address, right?
Yeah.
I'm not willing to give Zuckerberg anything because I don't trust him, but you get the idea. I mean, it will be that way with like DNA and other things. At some point, we'll just be like, yeah, just take my DNA. Like, sure, people can look and see that I'm a mental midget and my IQ is like lower than, I don't want to bring the bell curve up or whatever, but you could figure out, like, if we all put our DNA and sequenced online and be like, oh yeah, Lex has got 10 more IQ points than JCal, and Sam's got 10 more than Lex, and all of a sudden people are like all bent out of shape about it. But what if we did that and they were like, and by the way, you also, all 3 of you are going to get Parkinson's unless you do X, Y, and Z, unless you eat more blueberries or whatever we figure out.
They're going to accept it pretty quickly. Yeah, that's
brave new world.
Brave new world. I have to ask you, just like you were saying, you're one of the world experts in investing in startups. In startups. The VC. And also the question is how much of our life will be in digital, because it seems like we're heading towards more and more of our lives being in the digital space. So like innovation in the physical space might become less and less significant. Like, why do you need to drive anywhere if most of your life is spent in virtual reality?
I still would like, to, at least at the moment, my impression is that I would like to have a physical contact with other people, and that's very important to me. We don't have a way to replicate it in the computer. It might be the case that over the time it will change.
Like in 10 years from now, why not have like an arbitrary infinite number of people you can interact with? Some of them are real, some are not, with arbitrary characteristics that you can define based on your own preferences.
I think that's maybe where we are heading, and maybe I'm resisting the future.
Yeah. I'm telling you, if I got to choose, if I could live in Elder Scrolls Skyrim versus the real world, I'm not so sure I would stay with the real world.
Yeah, I mean, the question is, will VR be sufficient to get us there, or do you need to, plug electrodes in the brain?
Yeah.
And it would be nice if these electrodes wouldn't be invasive.
Yeah. Or at least like provably non-destructive. But in the digital space, do you think we'll be able to solve the Turing test, the spirit of the Turing test, which is, do you think we'll be able to achieve compelling natural language conversation between people, like have friends that are AI systems on the internet?
I totally think it's doable.
Do you think the current approach of GPT will take us there?
So there is, the part of at first learning all the content out there. And I think that still system should keep on learning as it speaks with you.
Yeah.
And I think that should work. The question is how exactly to do it. And, obviously we have people at OpenAI asking these questions, and kind of at first pre-training on all existing content is like a backbone, and is a decent backbone.
What do you think of the experience of self, just the experience of the world in a virtual world, in virtual reality? Is it possible that we can create sort of offsprings of our consciousness by existing in a virtual world long enough? So, yeah, can we be conscious in the same kind of deep way that we are in this real world by hanging out in a virtual world?
Yeah, well, the kind of virtual worlds we have now are interesting but limited in certain ways. In particular, they rely on us having a brain and so on, which is outside the virtual world. Maybe I'll strap on my VR headset or just hang out in a virtual world on a screen, but my brain and then my physical environment might be simulated if I'm in a virtual world. But right now, there's no attempt to simulate my brain. There might be some non-player characters in these virtual worlds that have simulated cognitive systems of certain kinds that dictate their behavior. But mostly they're pretty simple right now. I mean, some people are trying to put a bit of AI in their non-player characters to make them smarter. But for now, inside virtual worlds, the actual thinking is interestingly distinct from the physics of those virtual worlds. In a way, actually, I like to think this is kind of reminiscent of the way that Descartes thought our physical world was. There's physics, and there's the mind, and they're separate. Now we think the mind is somehow connected to physics pretty deeply. But in these virtual worlds, there's a physics of a virtual world. And then there's this brain, which is totally outside the virtual world, that controls it and interacts it. When anyone exercises agency in a video game, and that's actually somebody outside the virtual world moving a controller, controlling the interaction of things inside the virtual world. So right now, in virtual worlds, the mind is somehow outside the world. But you could imagine in the future, once we have developed serious AI, artificial general intelligence, and so on, then we could come to virtual worlds which have enough sophistication. You could actually simulate a brain or have a genuine AGI, which would then presumably be able to act in equally sophisticated ways, maybe even more sophisticated ways inside the virtual world to how it might in the physical world. And then the question is going to come along. That would be kind of a VR, a virtual world internal intelligence. And then the question is, could they have consciousness, experience, intelligence, free will, all the things that we have? And again, my view is, I don't see why not.
To linger on it a little bit, I find virtual reality really incredibly powerful. Just even the crude virtual reality we have now. Perhaps there's psychological effects that make some people more amenable to virtual worlds than others, but I find myself wanting to stay in virtual worlds for long periods. Yes,
even with a headset or on a desktop.
No, with a headset.
Really interesting, because I am totally addicted to using the internet and things on a desktop. But when it comes to VR with a headset, I don't typically use it for more than 10 or 20 minutes. There's something just slightly aversive about it, I find. So I don't right now, even though I have Oculus Rift and Oculus Quest and HTC Vive and Samsung this and that.
You just don't want to stay in that world.
Not for extended periods. You actually find yourself hanging out in that?
Something about it's both a combination of just imagination and considering the possibilities of where this goes in the future. It feels like I want to almost prepare my brain for I want to explore sort of Disneyland when it's first being built in the early days.
Yeah.
And it feels like I'm walking around almost imagining the possibilities, and something through that process allows my mind to really enter into that world. But you say that the brain is external to that virtual world. It is, strictly speaking, true. But
if you're in VR and you do brain surgery on an avatar, you're going to open up that skull. What are you going to find? Sorry, nothing there.
Nothing.
The brain is elsewhere.
You don't think it's possible to kind of separate them? And I don't mean in a sense like Descartes, like a hard separation, but basically, do you think it's possible with the brain outside of the virtual rid, when you're wearing a headset, create a new consciousness for prolonged periods of time? Really feel, really experience, forget that your brain is outside.
So this is going to be the case where the brain is still outside.
Still outside.
But could living in the VR, I mean, we already find this, right, with video games.
Exactly.
They're completely immersive, and you get taken up by living in those worlds, and it becomes your reality for a while.
So they're not completely immersive; they're just very immersive.
You don't forget the external world. No.
Exactly. So that's what I'm asking. Do you think it's almost possible to really forget the external world? Really immerse yourself.
What, to forget completely? Why would we forget? We got pretty good memories. Maybe you can stop paying attention to the external world, but this already happens a lot. I go to work and maybe I'm not paying attention to my home life. I go to a movie and I'm immersed in that. So that degree of immersion, absolutely. But we still have the capacity to remember it, to completely forget the external world. I'm thinking that would probably take some pretty serious drugs or something to make your make your brain do that.
Is it possible? So, I mean, I guess I'm getting at, is consciousness truly a property that's tied to the physical brain? Or can it can you create sort of different offspring, copies of consciousnesses based on the worlds that you enter?
Well, the way we're doing it now, at least with a standard VR, there's just one brain. Interacts with the physical world,
That's right.
Plays a video game, puts on a video headset, interacts with this virtual world. And I think we'd typically say there's one consciousness here that nonetheless undergoes different environments, takes on different characters, in different environments. This is already something that happens in the non-virtual world. I might interact one way in my home life, my work life, my social life, and so on. So at the very least, that will happen in a virtual world very naturally. People sometimes adopt a character of avatars very different from themselves, maybe even a different gender, different race, different social background. So that much is certainly possible. I would see that as a single consciousness, taking on different personas. So if you want literal splitting of consciousness into multiple copies, I think it's going to take something more radical than that. Like, maybe you can run different simulations of your brain in different realities and then expose them to different histories. And then, you'd split yourself into 10 different simulated copies, which then undergo different environments and then ultimately do become 10 very different consciousnesses. Maybe that could happen, but now we're not talking about something that's possible in the near term. We're going to have brain simulations and AGI for that to happen.
Got it. So before any of that happens, it's fundamentally you see it as a singular consciousness, even though it's experiencing different environments, virtual or not. It's still connected to the same set of memories, same set of experiences, and therefore one sort of joint conscious system.
Yeah, or at least no more multiple than the kind of multiple consciousness that we get from inhabiting different environments in a non-virtual world.
Is it possible that the entirety of the universe, our planet, all the people in New York, all the organisms on our planet, including me here today, are not real in that sense? They're all part of an illusion inside of Dave Chalmers' head.
I think all this could be a simulation.
No, but not just a simulation.
Yeah.
Because the simulation kind of is outside of you.
A dream?
What if it's all an illusion? Yes, a dream that you're experiencing. It's all in your mind, right? Like, can you take illusionism that far?
Well, there's illusionism about the external world and illusionism about consciousness, and these might go in
perspective.
Different. Illusionism about the external world kind of takes you back to Descartes. And could all this be produced by an evil demon? Descartes himself also had the dream argument. He said, how do you know you're not dreaming right now? Right. How do you know this is not an amazing dream? And I think it's at least a possibility that, this could be some super duper complex dream in the next universe up. I guess, though, my attitude is that Descartes thought that if the evil demon was doing it, it's not real. A lot of people these days say if a simulation is doing it, it's not real. As I was saying before, I think even if it's a simulation, that doesn't stop this from being real. It just tells us what the world is made of. Likewise, if it's a dream, it could turn out that all this is like my dream created by my brain and the next universe up. My own view is that wouldn't stop this physical world from being real. It would turn out this cup, at the most fundamental level, was made of a bit of, say, my consciousness in the dreaming mind at the next level up. Maybe that would give you a weird kind of panpsychism about reality, but it wouldn't show that the cup isn't real. It would just tell us it's ultimately made of processes in my dreaming mind. So I'd resist the idea that if the physical world is a dream, then it's an illusion.
That is right. By the way, do you think we're living in a simulation?
I don't rule it out. There's probably going to be a lot of simulations in the history of the cosmos. If the simulation is designed well enough, it'll be indistinguishable from a non-simulated reality. And although we could keep searching for evidence that we're not in a simulation, any of that evidence in principle could be simulated. So I think it's a possibility.
But do you think the thought experiment is interesting or useful to calibrate how we think about the nature of reality?
Yeah, I definitely think it's interesting and useful. In fact, I'm actually writing a book about this right now, all about the simulation idea. using it to shed light on a whole bunch of philosophical questions. So, the big one is, how do we know anything about the external world? Descartes said, maybe you're being fooled by an evil demon who's stimulating your brain into thinking all this stuff is real when in fact it's all made up. Well, the modern version of that is, how do you know you're not in a simulation? And the thought is, if you're in a simulation, none of this is real. So that's teaching you something about knowledge. How do you know about the external world? I think there's also really interesting questions about the nature of reality right here. I mean, if we are in a simulation, is all this real? Is there really a table here? Is there really a microphone? Do I really have a body? The standard view would be, no, we don't. None of this would be real. My view is actually that's wrong. And even if we are in a simulation, all of this is real. That's why I call this reality 2.0. New version of reality, different version of reality, still reality.
So what's the difference between quote unquote real world and the world that we perceive? So we interact with the world with the world by perceiving it. It only really exists through the window of our perception system and in our mind. So what's the difference between something that's quote unquote real, that exists perhaps without us being there, and the world as you perceive it?
Well, the world as we perceive it is a very simplified and distorted version of what's going on underneath. We already know that from just thinking about science. You don't see too many, obviously, quantum mechanical effects in what we perceive, but we still know quantum mechanics is going on under all things. So I like to think the world we perceive is this very kind of simplified picture of colors and shapes existing in space and so on. And we know that's what the philosopher Wilfrid Sellers called the manifest image, the world as it seems to us. We already know underneath all that is a very different scientific image with atoms or quantum wave functions or superstrings or whatever the latest thing is. And that's the ultimate scientific reality. So I think of the simulation idea as basically another hypothesis about what the ultimate, say, quasi-scientific or metaphysical reality is going on underneath the world of the manifest image. The world of the manifest image is this very simple thing that we interact with that's neutral on the underlying stuff of reality. Science can help tell us about that. Maybe philosophy can help tell us about that too. And if we eventually take the red pill and find out we're in a simulation, my view is that's just another view about what reality is made of. The philosopher Immanuel Kant said, what is the nature of the thing in itself? I've got a glass here and it's got all these, it appears to me a certain way, a certain shape, it's liquid, it's clear. But he said, what is the nature of the thing in itself? Well, I think of the simulation idea, it's a hypothesis about the nature of the thing in itself. It turns out if we're in a simulation, the thing in itself, nature of this glass, it's actually a bunch of data structures running on a computer in the next universe up.
Yeah, that's what people tend to do when they think about simulation. They think about our modern computers and somehow trivially, crudely just scaled up in some sense. But do you think the simulation, in order to actually simulate something as complicated as our universe that's made up of molecules and atoms and particles and quarks and maybe even strings, all of that requires something just infinitely many orders of magnitude more of scale and complexity. Do you think we're even able to even conceptualize what it would take to simulate our universe? Or does it just slip into this idea that you basically have to build a universe, something so big to simulate it? Does it get this into this fuzzy area that's not useful at all?
Yeah, well, our universe is obviously incredibly complicated. And for us within our universe to build a simulation of a universe as complicated as ours is going to have obvious problems here. If the universe is finite, there's just no way that's going to work. Maybe there's some cute way to make it work if the universe is infinite. Maybe an infinite universe could somehow simulate a copy of itself, but that's going to be hard. Nonetheless, just so we are in a simulation, I think there's no particular reason why we have to think the simulating universe has to be anything like ours.
You've said before that it might be. So you could think of it in turtles all the way down. You could think of the simulating universe different than ours, but we ourselves could also create another simulated universe. So you said that there could be these kind of levels of universes, and you've also mentioned this hilarious idea, maybe tongue in cheek, maybe not, that there may be simulations within simulations, arbitrarily stacked levels, and that we may be in level 42.
Oh, yeah.
Along those stacks, referencing Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe. If we're indeed in a simulation within a simulation at level 42, what do you think level 0 looks like?
I would expect that level 0 is truly enormous. I mean, not just if it's finite, it's some extraordinarily large finite capacity. Much more likely, it's infinite. Maybe it's got some very high set theoretic cardinality that enables it to support just any number of simulations. So, high degree of infinity at level 0, slightly smaller degree of infinity at level 1. So by the time you get down to us at level 42, maybe there's plenty of room for lots of simulations of finite capacity. If the top universe is only a small finite capacity, then obviously that's going to put very, very serious limits on how many simulations you're going to be able to get running. So I think we can certainly confidently say that if we're at level 42, then the top level is pretty damn big.
So it gets more and more constrained as we get down levels, more and more simplified and constrained and limited in resources. And
we still have plenty of capacity here. What was it? Feynman said? He said there's plenty of room at the bottom. We're still a number of levels above the degree where there's room for fundamental computing, physical computing capacity, quantum computing capacity at the bottom level. So we got plenty of room to play with and make. We probably have plenty of room for simulations of pretty sophisticated universes, perhaps none as complicated as our universe, unless our universe is infinite, but still, at the very least, for pretty serious finite universes, but maybe universes somewhat simpler than ours, unless, of course, we're prepared to take certain shortcuts in the simulation, which might then increase the capacity significantly.
Do you think the human mind, us people, in terms of the complexity of simulation, is at the height of what the simulation might be able to achieve? Like, if you look at incredible entities that could be created in this universe of ours, do you have an intuition about how incredible human beings are on that scale?
I think we're pretty impressive, but we're not that impressive.
Are we above average?
I mean, I think kind of human beings are at a certain point in the scale of intelligence, which made many things possible. You get through evolution, through single-cell organisms, through fish and mammals and primates, and something happens. Once you get to human beings, we've just reached that level where we get to develop language, we get to develop certain kinds of culture, and we get to develop certain kinds of collective thinking that has enabled all this amazing stuff to happen, science and literature and engineering and culture and so on. Still, we are just at the beginning of that on the evolutionary threshold. It's kind of like we just got there, who knows, a few thousand or tens of thousands of years ago. So we're probably just at the very beginning for what's possible there. So I'm inclined to think among the scale of intelligent beings, we're somewhere very near the bottom. I would expect that, for example, if we're in a simulation, then the simulators who created us have got the capacity to be far more sophisticated. If we're at level 42, who knows what the ones at level 0 are like.
It's also possible that this is the epitome of what is possible to achieve. So we as human beings see ourselves maybe as flawed, see all the constraints, all the limitations, but maybe that's the magical, the beautiful thing. Maybe those limitations are the essential elements for an interesting sort of that edge of chaos, that interesting existence, that if you make us much more intelligent, if you make us much more powerful in any kind of dimension of performance, maybe you lose something fundamental that makes life worth living. So you kind of have this optimistic view that we're this little baby, that then there's so much growth and potential. But this could also be it. This is the most amazing thing is us.
Maybe what you're saying is consistent with what I'm saying. I mean, we could still have levels of intelligence far beyond us, but maybe those levels of intelligence, on your view, would be kind of boring, and we kind of get so good at everything that life suddenly becomes unidimensional. So we're just inhabiting this one spot of like maximal romanticism in the history of evolution.
Yeah.
You get to humans, and it's like, and then years to come, our super intelligent descendants are going to look back at us and say, those were the days when they just hit the point of inflection and life was interesting. I am an optimist, so I'd like to think that, if there is super intelligence somewhere in the future, they'll figure out how to make life super interesting and super romantic.
Well, you know what they're going to do. So what they're going to do is they realize how boring life is when you're super intelligent. So they create a new level of a simulation and sort of live through the things they've created by watching them stumble about in their flawed ways. So maybe so you create a new level of a simulation every time you get really bored with how smart and
this would be kind of sad though, because it would show that the peak of their existence would be like watching simulations for entertainment. That's like saying the peak of our existence now is Netflix. It's all right.
A flip side of that could be the peak of our existence for many people having children and watching them grow. That becomes very meaningful.
Okay, so you create a simulation that's like creating a family.
Creating any kind of creation is kind of a powerful act. Do you think it's easier to simulate the mind or the universe? So I've heard several people, including Nick Bostrom, think about ideas of, maybe you don't need to simulate the universe, you can just simulate the human mind. Or in general, just the distinction between simulating the entirety of it, the entirety of the physical world, or just simulating the mind. Which one do you see as more challenging?
Well, I think in some sense the answer is obvious. It has to be simpler to simulate the mind than to simulate the universe, because the mind is part of the universe. And in order to fully simulate the universe, you're going to have to simulate the mind. So unless we're talking about partial simulations.
And I guess the question is, which comes first? Does the mind come before the universe, or does the universe come before the mind? So the mind could just be an emergent phenomena in this universe. So simulation is an interesting thing that, it's not like creating a simulation perhaps requires you to program every single thing that happens in it. Mm-hmm. It's just defining a set of initial conditions and rules based on which it behaves. Mm-hmm. Simulating the mind requires you to have a little bit more. We're now in a little bit of a crazy land, but it requires you to understand the fundamentals of cognition, perhaps of consciousness, of perception, of everything like that. That's not created through some kind of emergence from basic physics laws, but more requires you to actually understand the fundamentals of the mind.
How about if we said simulate the brain?
The brain.
Rather than the mind. So the brain is just a big physical system. The universe is a giant physical system. To simulate the universe, at the very least, you're going to have to simulate the brains as well as all the other physical systems within it. And, it's not obvious that the problems are any worse for the brain than for... It's a particularly complex physical system, but if we can simulate arbitrary physical systems, we can simulate brains. There is this further question of whether, when you simulate a brain, will that bring along all the features of the mind with it? Like, will you get consciousness? Will you get thinking? Will you get free will? And so on. And that's something philosophers have argued over for years. My own view is if you simulate the brain well enough, that will also simulate the mind. But there's plenty of people who would say no. You'd merely get like a zombie system, a simulation of a brain without any true consciousness.
But for you put together a brain, the consciousness comes with it, arise.
Yeah, I don't think it's obvious.
But that's your intuition.
My view is roughly that, what is responsible for consciousness? It's in the patterns of information processing and so on, rather than, say, the biology that it's made of. There's certainly plenty of people out there who think consciousness has to be, say, biological. So if you merely replicate the patterns of information processing in a non-biological substrate, you'll miss what's crucial for consciousness. I mean, I just don't think there's any particular reason to think that biology is special here. You can imagine substituting the biology for non-biological systems, say silicon circuits, that play the same role. The behavior will continue to be the same. And, I think just thinking about what is the true, when I think about the connection, the isomorphisms between consciousness and the brain, the deepest connections to me seem to connect consciousness to patterns of information processing, not to specific biology. So I at least adopted as my working hypothesis that basically it's the computation and the information that matters for consciousness. At the same time, we don't understand consciousness, so all this could be wrong.
So the computation, the flow, the processing, manipulation of information, the process is where the consciousness, the software is where the consciousness comes from, not the hardware.
Roughly the software, yeah. The patterns of information processing, at least in the hardware, which we could view as software. It may not be something you can just like program and load and erase and so on in the way we can with ordinary software, but it's something at the level of information processing rather than at the level of implementation.
So on that,
well, so if I take you on like a 10-year fast forward,
yeah,
and I paint a picture of something today that seems absolutely insane, but there's early signs that people are building this, and let's just give them the benefit of the doubt that some of the early iterations will work and most of them won't. There's a world where you and I are participating in a digital economy, in a virtual world where whether it is a piece of art, it is a digital sculpture, it is a digital skin from a video game, it is a digital good that we purchased somewhere online, and we bring it and we display it in a digital museum or a virtual museum. And so now all of a sudden you can charge people for entry. You can consign digital goods.
Yeah.
It's the replication of what happens in the analog world, now just in digital. And when you do that, what you do is you take the addressable markets of these assets or these mechanisms, and they explode in the digital realm. And so now all of a sudden, how fast does the human race accelerate when it comes to human production, intelligence, learning,
all in the digital space.
Output? It's just if I said to you 20 years ago, I'm going to give you a global education. It means I'm going to take you and I'm going to physically move you to geography after geography after geography. It's going to take time, it's going to take resources, and ultimately it's going to take lots of effort. If I now said to you, hey, I'm going to transport you in this virtual world to multiple geographies, but you're going to experience it in this virtual world, and you're going to have digital goods that you can take from economy to economy or from location to location, all of a sudden maybe you get 90% of the value. You don't get 100% of the same value. You get 90% of the value. But you can do it at a much faster pace. And so in a 6-month period, you've actually made 3 times the progress than you would have if you had to do in the physical world. So that's where I think we're heading.
So there's digital art being displayed in the digital museum, and people are being charged for access. And perhaps we plug in our senses, which means we start to operate more and more in a virtual reality, augmented reality, virtual reality way with this digital world, and increasingly go into this world. Basically lived most of our productive and social lives in this digital world, and increasingly essentially create a simulation where the biological basis is just there to sustain the brain that's used to operate in the virtual world. Taking us back to the original, when we started talking about war, I wonder what conflict looks like in that world. That the people who are born today maybe will be fighting wars in the space, in that museum world, in that digital world.
Remember what I said. We're moving from a world of conflict surrounded and determined by bombs, bullets, and soldiers to a battlefield that is determined by war of information and cyber capabilities. And so in that virtual world, is it about death and destruction of human life in the physical analog world? Or will it become more important to attack or defend virtual property and virtual life and, some level of virtual sovereignty? In my opinion, the latter is more likely. And so what you start to understand is, well, what do you truly value in your life? Is it the physical analog, materialistic, consumptive goods? Or is it virtual? And in many cases, something as simple as the ability to connect with somebody is really important. And so one of the most disruptive, combative, violent things that a country may do to another country in the future is simply take down the internet and put people in isolation.
Yeah.
I don't need to physically harm you if I can psychologically harm you. I don't need to.
It's terrifying.
Yeah, I don't need to actually convince you through a monopoly on violence, on physical violence. What if I can psychologically change the way you see the world through misinformation, through all sorts of nefarious activities? And I think that, the United States has been struggling with this idea over the last couple of years in the political arena. But what happens when it starts to come to other aspects of our life?
From an understanding perspective, there's the Richard Feynman, maybe attributed to him, but maybe many others, is this idea that if you can't explain something simply, that you don't understand it. In how many cases, how often is that true? Do you find there's some profound truth in that?
Oh, okay. So you were about to ask, is it true? To which I would say flatly no. But then you followed that up with, is there some profound truth in it? And I'm like, okay, sure. So there's some truth in it.
But it's not true.
It's just not.
That's such a mathematician answer.
The truth that is in it is that learning to explain something helps you understand it. But real things are not simple. A few things are. Most are not. And to be honest, we don't really know whether Feynman really said that, right? Or something like that is sort of disputed. But I don't think Feynman could have literally believed that, whether or not he said it. And, he was the kind of guy, I didn't know him, but I've been reading his writing. He liked to sort of say stuff that sounded good. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So it's totally strikes me as the kind of thing he could have said because he liked the way saying it made him feel. But also knowing that he didn't literally mean it.
Well, I definitely have a lot of friends, and I've talked to a lot of physicists, and they do derive joy from believing that they can explain stuff simply, or believing it's possible to explain stuff simply, even when the explanation is not actually that simple. Like I've heard people think that the explanation is simple, and they do the explanation, and I think it is simple, but it's not capturing the phenomena that we're discussing. It's capturing, it somehow maps in their mind, but it's taking as a starting point, as an assumption that there's a deep knowledge and a deep understanding that's actually very complicated. And the simplicity is almost like a poem about the more complicated thing, as opposed to a distillation.
And I love poems, but a poem is not an explanation.
Well, some people might disagree with that, but certainly from a mathematical perspective,
no poet would disagree with it.
No poet would disagree. You don't think there's some things that can only be described imprecisely?
As an explanation. I don't think any poet would say their poem is an explanation. They might say it's a description. They might say it's sort of capturing sort of.
Well, some people might say the only truth is like music, right? That the not the only truth, but some truth can only be expressed through art. And I mean, that's the whole thing. We're talking about religion and myth. And there's some things that are limited cognitive capabilities, and the tools of mathematics or the tools of physics are just not going to allow us to capture. It's possible. Consciousness is one of those things.
Yes, that is definitely possible. But I would even say, look, I mean, consciousness is a thing about which we're still in the dark as to whether there's an explanation we would understand it as an explanation at all. By the way, okay, I got to give yet one more amazing Poincaré quote, because this guy just never stopped coming out with great quotes. That, Paul Erdős, another fellow who appears in the book, and by the way, he thinks about this notion of distance, of personal affinity, kind of like what we were talking about, the kind of social network, and that notion of distance that comes from that. So that's something that Paul
Erdős did.
Well, he thought about distances and networks. I guess he didn't think about the social network.
That's fascinating. And that's how it started, that story of Erdős number. Yeah, okay. Sorry to distract.
But Erdős was sort of famous for saying, and this is sort of along the lines you were saying, he talked about the book, capital T, capital B, the book. And that's the book where God keeps the right proof of every theorem. So when he saw a proof he really liked, it was like really elegant, really simple. Like that's from the book. That's like you found one of the ones that's in the book. He wasn't a religious guy, by the way. He referred to God as the supreme fascist. He was like, but somehow he was like, I don't really believe in God, but I believe in God's book. I mean, there was a but Poincaré, on the other hand, and by the way, there are other maths. Hilda Hudson is one who comes up in this book. She also kind of saw math. She's one of the people who sort of develops the disease model that we now use, that we use to sort of track pandemics, this SIR model. That sort of originally comes from her work with Ronald Ross. But she was also super, super, super devout. And she also, sort of on the other side of the religious coin, was like, yeah, math is how we communicate with God. She has a great, all these people are incredibly quotable. She says, math is, the truth, the things about mathematics, she's like, they're not the most important of God thoughts, but they're the only ones that we can know precisely. So she's like, this is the one place where we get to sort of see what God's thinking when we do mathematics.
Again, not a fan of poetry or music. Some people would say Hendrix is like, some people would say chapter 1 of that book is mathematics, and then chapter 2 is like classic rock. Right? So like, it's not clear that
I'm sorry, you just sent me off on a tangent, just imagining like Erdős at a Hendrix concert, like trying to sort of figure out if it was from the book or not. What I was coming to was just to say, but what Poincaré said about this is he's like, if like this is all worked out in the language of the divine, and if a divine being like came down and told it to us, we wouldn't be able to understand it, so it doesn't matter. So Poincaré was of the view that there were things that were sort of like inhumanly complex, and that was how they really were. Our job is to figure out the things that are not like that.
What is dualism? What is idealism? What is materialism? What is functionalism? And what connects with you most? In terms of, because he just mentioned there's a reality we don't have access to. Mm-hmm. Okay. What does that even mean? And why don't we get access to it? Aren't we part of that reality? Why can't we access it?
So the particular trajectory that mostly exists in the West is the result of our indoctrination by a cult for 2,000 years.
A cult? Which
one? The Catholic cult mostly.
Yes.
And for better or worse, right? It has created or defined many of the modes of interaction that we have that has created this society, but it has also, in some sense, scarred our rationality. And the intuition that exists, if you would translate the mythology of the Catholic Church into the modern world, is that the world in which you and me interact is something like a multiplayer role-playing adventure.
Yes.
And the money and the objects that we have in this world, this is all not real. Or as Eastern philosophers would say, it's Maya. It's just stuff that it appears to be meaningful, and this embedding in this meaning, if you believe in it, is samsara. It's basically the identification with the needs of the mundane, secular, everyday existence. And the Catholics also introduced the notion of higher meaning, the sacred. And this existed before, but eventually the natural shape of God is the Platonic form of the civilization that you're part of. It's basically the superorganism that is formed by the individuals as an intentional agent. And basically the Catholics used a relatively crude mythology to implement software on the minds of people and get the software synchronized to make them walk in lockstep, to basically get this God online and to make it efficient and effective. And I think God technically is just a self that spans multiple brains, as opposed to your and myself, which mostly exists just on one brain, right? Yeah. And so in some sense, you can construct a self functionally as a function that is implemented by brains that exists across brains. And this is a God with a small g.
That's one of the, if you Yuval Harari kind of talking about, this is one of the nice features of our brains. It seems that we can all download the same piece of software, like God in this case, and kind of share it.
Yeah, so basically you give everybody a spec, and the mathematical constraints that are intrinsic to information processing make sure that given the same spec, you come up with a compatible structure.
Okay, so there's the space of ideas that we all share, and we think that's kind of the mind, but that's separate from the idea is from Christianity, from religion, is that there's a separate thing between the mind.
There is a real world, and this real world is the world in which God exists. God is the coder of the multiplayer adventure, so to speak, and we are all players in this game. And
that's dualism. You would say
But
So
the dualist
dualism is like-
aspect is
yeah.
because the mental realm exists in a different implementation than the physical realm. And the mental realm is real. And a lot of people have this intuition that there is this real room in which you and me talk and speak right now. Then comes a layer of physics and abstract rules and so on. And then comes another real room where our souls are. And our true form is the thing that gives us phenomenal experience. And this is, of course, a very confused notion that you would get. And it's the result of connecting materialism and idealism in the wrong way.
So, okay, I apologize, but I think it's really helpful if we just try to define terms. Like, what is dualism? What is idealism? What is materialism for people who don't know?
So the idea of dualism in our cultural tradition is that there are two substances, a mental substance and a physical substance, and they interact by different rules. And the physical world is basically causally closed and is built on a low-level causal structure. So they're basically a bottom level that is causally closed, that's entirely mechanical. Yes. And mechanical in the widest sense. So it's computational. There's basically a physical world in which information flows around, and physics describes the laws of how information flows around in this world.
Would you compare it to like a computer where you have a hardware and software?
The computer is a generalization of information flowing around. Basically, what Turing discovered, that there is a universal principle. You can define this universal machine that is able to perform all the computations. So all these machines have the same power. This means that you can always define a translation between them as long as they have unlimited memory to be able to perform each other's computations.
So would you then say that materialism is this whole world is just the hardware and idealism is this whole world is just the software?
Not quite. I think that most idealists don't have a notion of software yet, because software also comes down to information processing. Right, so what you notice is the only thing that is real to you and me is this experiential world in which things matter, in which things have taste, in which things have color, phenomenal content, and so on.
Oh,
and
you realize are bringing up consciousness, okay?
And this is distinct from the physical world, in which things have values only in an abstract sense, and you only look at cold patterns moving around. So how does anything feel like something? And this connection between the two things is very puzzling to a lot of people, and of course to many philosophers. So idealism starts out with the notion that mind is primary, materialism thinks that matter is primary. Yes. And so for the idealist, the material patterns that we say playing out are part of the dream that the mind is dreaming. And we exist in a mind on a higher plane of existence, if you want. And for the materialist, there is only this material thing, and that generates some models, and we are the result of these models. And in some sense, I don't think that we should understand, if you understand it properly, materialism and idealism is a dichotomy, but as two different aspects of the same thing. So the weird thing is we don't exist in the physical world. We do exist inside of a story that the brain tells itself.
Okay, let me my information processing take that in. We don't exist in the physical world. We exist in the narrative.
Basically, a brain cannot feel anything. A neuron cannot feel anything. They're physical things. Physical systems are unable to experience anything. But it would be very useful for the brain or for the organism to know what it would be like to be a person and to feel something.
Yeah.
So the brain creates a simulacrum of such a person that it uses to model the interactions of the person. It's the best model of what that brain, this organism, thinks it is in relationship to its environment. So it creates that model. It's a story, a multimedia novel that the brain is continuously writing and updating.
But you also kind of said that we kind of exist in that story.
Yes.
In that story. What is real in any of this? So like there's again, these terms are, you kind of said there's a quantum graph. I mean, what is this whole thing running on then? Is the story, and is it completely fundamentally impossible to get access to it? Because isn't the story isn't the brain in something, existing in some kind of context?
So what we can identify as computer scientists, we can engineer systems and test our theories this way that may have the necessary and sufficient properties to produce the phenomena that we are observing, which is there is a self in a virtual world that is generated in somebody's neocortex that is contained in the skull of this primate here. And when I point at this indexicality is of course wrong. But I do create something that is likely to give rise to patterns on your retina that allow you to interpret what I'm saying, right? Mm-hmm. But we both know that the world that you and me are seeing is not the real physical world. What we are seeing is a virtual reality generated in your brain to explain the patterns on your retina.
How close is it to the real world? That's kind of the question. Is it when you have like people like Donald Hoffman, let's say that you're really far away. The thing we're seeing, you and I now, that interface we have is very far away from anything. Like we don't even have anything close like to the sense of what the real world is. Or is it a very surface piece of architecture?
Imagine you look at the Mandelbrot fractal, right? This famous thing that Bernard Mandelbrot discovered.
Mandelbrot, yeah.
If you see an overall shape in there, right? But you know, if you truly understand it, you know it's 2 lines of code. It's basically in a series that is being tested for complex numbers in the complex number plane for every point. And for those where the series is diverging, you paint this black. Yes. And where it's converging, you don't. And you get the intermediate colors by checking how far it diverges.
Yes.
Right. This gives you this shape of this fractal. But imagine you live inside of this fractal and you don't have access to where you are in the fractal, or you have not discovered the generator function even. Right. So what you see is all I can see right now is a spiral, and the spiral moves a little bit to the right. Is this an accurate model of reality? Yes, it is. Right. It is an adequate description. You know that there is actually no spiral in the Mandelbrot fractal. It only appears like this to an observer that is interpreting things as a 2-dimensional space and then defines certain regularities in there at a certain scale that it currently observes, because if you zoom in, the spiral might disappear and turn out to be something different at a different resolution, right?
Yes.
So at this level, you have the spiral, and then you discover the spiral moves to the right and at some point it disappears. So you have a singularity. At this point, your model is no longer valid. You cannot predict what happens beyond the singularity. But you can observe again and you will see it hit another spiral, and at this point it disappeared. So maybe now have a second order law. And if you make 30 layers of these laws, then you have a description of the world that is similar to the one that we come up with when we describe the reality around us. It's reasonably predictive. It does not cut to the core of it. It does not explain how it's being generated, yes, how it actually works, but it's relatively good to explain the universe that we are entangled with.
But you don't think the tools of computer science or the tools of physics could step outside, see the whole drawing, and get at the basic mechanism of how the pattern, the spirals are generated?
Imagine you would find yourself embedded into a Mandelbrot fractal and you try to figure out what works, and you somehow have a Turing machine with enough memory to think, and as a result, you come to this idea, it must be some kind of automaton, and maybe you just enumerate all the possible automata until you get to the one that produces your reality. Yeah. So you can identify necessary and sufficient condition. For instance, we discover that mathematics itself is the domain of all languages. Yeah. And then we see that most of the domains of mathematics that we have discovered are in some sense describing the same fractals. This is what category theory is obsessed about, that you can map these different domains to each other. So there are not that many fractals. And some of these have interesting structure and symmetry breaks. And so you can discover what region of this global fractal you might be embedded in from first principles.
Yes.
But the only way you can get there is from first principles. So basically, your understanding of the universe has to start with automata and then number theory and then spaces and so on.
Yeah, I think like Stephen Wolf from Still dreams that he'll be able to arrive at the fundamental rules of the cellular automata, or the generalization of which is behind our universe.
Yeah.
You've said on this topic, you said in a recent conversation that, quote, some people think that a simulation can't be conscious and only a physical system can, but they got it completely backward. A physical system cannot be conscious. Only a simulation can be conscious.
Yeah.
Consciousness is a simulated property of the simulated self. Just like you said, the mind is kind of we'll call it story narrative. There's a simulation, so our mind is essentially a simulation.
Usually, I try to use the terminology so that the mind is basically the principles that produce the simulation. It's the software that is implemented by your brain.
Yeah.
And the mind is creating both the universe that we are in and the self, the idea of a person that is on the other side of attention and is embedded in this world.
Why is that important, that idea of a self? Why is that an important feature in the simulation?
It's basically a result of the purpose that the mind has. It's a tool for modeling, right? We are not actually monkeys. We are side effects of the regulation needs of monkeys. And what the monkey has to regulate is the relationship of an organism to an outside world that is in large part also consisting of other organisms. And as a result, it basically has regulation targets that it tries to get to. These regulation targets start with priors. They're basically like unconditional reflexes that we are more or less born with. And then we can reverse engineer them to make them more consistent. And then we get more detailed models about how the world works and how to interact with it. And so these priors that you commit to are largely target values that our needs should approach, set points. And this deviation to the set point creates some urge, some tension. And we find ourselves living inside of feedback loops, right? Consciousness emerges over dimensions of disagreements with the universe. Things where you care, where things are not the way they should be, where you need to regulate. And so in some sense, the sense itself is the result of all the identifications that you're having. An identification is a regulation target that you're committing to. It's a dimension that you care about, that you think is important. And this is also what locks you in. If you let go of these commitments, of these identifications, you get free. There's nothing that you have to do anymore. And if you let go of all of them, you're completely free and you can enter nirvana because you're done.
And actually, this is a good time to pause and say thank you to sort of a friend of mine, Gustav Soderstrom, who introduced me to your work. I wanted to give him a shout out. He's a brilliant guy, and I think the AI community is actually quite amazing, and Gustav is a good representative of that. You are as well. So I'm glad, first of all, I'm glad the internet exists and YouTube exists where I can watch your talks and then get to your book and study your writing and think about, that's amazing. Okay. But you've kind of describing sort of this emergent phenomena of consciousness from the simulation.
For some reason.
What's interesting, I don't know how I found myself in this sets of that part of the internet, but there's quite a lot of discussion about what it's like to do math on LSD, because apparently one of the deepest thinking processes needed is those of mathematicians or theoretical computer scientists. Basically, doing anything that involves math is proofs, and you have to think creatively but also deeply, and you have to think for many hours at a time. And so they're always looking for ways to, like, is there any sparks of creativity that could be injected? And apparently, out of all the psychedelics, the worst is LSD because it completely destroys your ability to do math well. And I wonder whether that has to do with your ability to visualize geometric things in a stable way in your mind and hold them there and stitch things together, which is often what's required for proofs. But again, it's difficult to kind of research these kinds of concepts, but it does make me wonder what are the spaces, how is the space of things you're able to think about and explore morphed by different psychedelics or dream states and so on, and how is that different? How much does it overlap with reality? And what is reality? Is there a waking state reality? Or is it just a tiny subset of reality and we get to take a step in other versions of it? We tend to think very much in a space-time, 4-dimensional. There's a 3-dimensional world, there's time, and that's what we think about reality. And we think of traveling as walking from point A to point B in the 3-dimensional world. But that's a very kind of human surviving, trying not to get eaten by a lion conception of reality. What if traveling is something like we do with psychedelics and meet the elves? What if thinking or the space of ideas as we kind of grow and think through ideas, that's traveling? Or what if memories is traveling? I don't know if you have a favorite view of reality, or if you had, by the way, I should say, an excellent conversation with Donald Hoffman.
Yeah, he's interesting.
Is there any inkling of his sense in your mind that reality is very far from actual, like, objective reality is very far from the kind of reality we imagine, we perceive, and we play with in our human minds?
Well, the first thing to grant is that we are never in direct contact with reality, whatever it is, unless that reality is consciousness, right? So we're only ever experiencing consciousness and its contents.
Right.
And then the question is, how does that circumstance relate to, quote, reality at large? And Donald Hoffman is somebody who's happy to speculate, well, maybe there isn't a reality at large. Maybe it's all just consciousness on some level. And that's interesting. That runs into, to my eye, various philosophical problems that, or at least you have to do a lot. You have to add to that picture, picture of idealism. That's usually the whole family of views that would just say that the universe is just mind or just consciousness. At bottom, will go by the name of idealism in Western philosophy. You have to add to that idealistic picture all kinds of epicycles and kind of weird coincidences, and to get the predictability of our experience and the success of materialist science to make sense in that context, right? And so the fact that what does it mean to say that there's only consciousness at bottom, right? Nothing outside of consciousness, because no one's ever experienced anything outside of consciousness. There's no scientist has ever done an experiment where they were contemplating data, no matter how far removed from our sense bases, whether it's they're looking at the Hubble deep field or they're smashing atoms or whatever tools they're using, they're still just experiencing consciousness and its various deliverances, and layering their concepts on top of that. So that's always true, and yet that somehow doesn't seem to capture the character of our continually discovering that our materialist assumptions are confirmable, right? So you take the fact that we unleash this fantastic amount of energy from within an atom, right? We have the theoretical suggestion that it's possible, right? To come back to Einstein, there's a lot of energy in that matter, right? And what if we could release it, right? And then we perform an experiment at, in this case, the Trinity test site in New Mexico, where the people who are most adequate to this conversation, people like Robert Oppenheimer, are standing around not altogether certain it's going to work, right? They're performing an experiment. They're wondering what's going to happen. They're wondering if their calculations around the yield are off by orders of magnitude. Some of them are still wondering whether the entire atmosphere of Earth is going to combust, right? That the nuclear chain reaction is not going to stop. And lo and behold, there was that energy to be released from within the nucleus of an atom. And that it's just what the picture one forms from those kinds of experiments, and just the knowledge is just our understanding of evolution, just the fact that the Earth is billions of years old and life is hundreds of millions of years old, and we weren't here to think about any of those things. And all of those processes were happening, therefore, in the dark. And they are the processes that allowed us to emerge, from prior life forms in the first place. To say that it's all that nothing exists outside of conscious minds of the sort that we experience, it just seems like a bizarrely anthropocentric claim. Analogous to, the moon isn't there if no one's looking at it, right? I mean, the moon as a moon isn't there if no one's looking at it. I'll grant that, because that's already a kind of fabrication born of concepts. But the idea that there's nothing there, that there's nothing that corresponds to what we experience as the moon, unless someone's looking at it, that just seems just a way too parochial way to set out on this journey of discoveries.
There is something there. There's a computer waiting to render the moon when you look at it. The capacity for the moon to exist is there. So if we're indeed living in a simulation, which I find a compelling thought experiment, it's possible that there is a kind of rendering mechanism, but not in a silly way that we think about in video games, but in some kind of more fundamental physics way.
And we have to account for the fact that it renders experiences that no one has had yet, that no one has any expectation of having. It can violate the expectations of everyone lawfully, right? And then there's some lawful understanding of why that's so. It's like, just to bring it back to mathematics, like certain numbers are prime whether we have discovered them or not, right? Like there's the highest prime number that anyone can name now, and then there's the next prime number that no one can name, and it's there, right? So it's like it's to say that our minds are putting it there, that what we know as mind in ourselves is in some way, in some sense, putting it there. That like that the base layer of reality is consciousness, right? That we're identical to the thing that is rendering this reality. There's some, hubris is the wrong word, but it's like it's okay if reality is bigger than what we experience, and it has structure that we can't anticipate, and that isn't just. Again, there's certainly a collaboration between our minds and whatever is out there to produce what we call, the stuff, of life. But it's not the idea that it's. I don't know. There are a few stops on the train of idealism and kind of New Age thinking and Eastern philosophy that I don't, philosophically, I don't see a need to take. The place, experientially and scientifically, I feel like you can get everything you want, acknowledging that consciousness has a character that can be explored from its own side, so that you're bringing kind of the first person experience back into the conversation about what is a human mind and what is true. And you can explore it with different degrees of rigor, and there are things to be discovered there, whether you're using a technique like meditation or psychedelics, and that these experiences have to be put in conversation with what we understand about ourselves from a third-person side, neuroscientifically or in any other way.
But to me, the question is, what if reality? The sense I have from this kind of, you play shooters?
No.
There's a physics engine that that's pretty.
You mean first-person shooter games?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, not often, but yes.
There's a physics engine that generates consistent reality, right? My sense is the same could be true for our universe, in the following sense, that our conception of reality, as we understand it now in the 21st century, is a tiny subset of the full reality. It's not that the reality that we conceive of that's there, the moon being there, is not there somehow. It's that it's a tiny fraction of what's actually out there. And so the physics engine of the universe is just maintaining the useful physics, the useful reality, quote unquote, for us to have a consistent experience as human beings. But maybe we, descendants of apes, are really only understand like 0.0001% of actual physics of reality. Like this, we can even just start with the consciousness thing, but maybe our minds we're just too dumb by design.
I that truly resonates with me, and I'm surprised it doesn't resonate more with most scientists that I talk to. When you just look at you look at how close we are to chimps, right? And chimps don't know anything, right?
Yeah.
Clearly, they have no idea what's going on, right? Yeah. And then you get us, but then it's only a subset of human beings that really understand much of what we're talking about on any in any area of specialization. And if they all died in their sleep tonight, right, you'd be left with people who might take 1,000 years to rebuild the internet, or if ever, right? Literally, it's like and I would extend this to myself. I mean, there are areas of scientific specialization where I have either no discernible competence. I've spent no time on it. I have not acquired the tools. It would just be an article of faith for me to think that I could acquire the tools to actually make a breakthrough in those areas. And I mean, your own area is one. I mean, I've never spent any significant amount of time trying to be a programmer, but it's pretty obvious I'm not Alan Turing, right? It's like if that were my capacity, I would have discovered that in myself. I would have found programming irresistible. My first false starts in learning, I think it was C. It was just, I bounced off. It's like, this was not fun. I hate trying to figure out what the syntax error that's causing this thing not to compile was just a fucking awful experience. I hated it, right? I hated every minute of it. So it was not, so if it was just people like me left, like, when do we get the internet again, right? And we lose the internet. When do we get it again, right? When do we get anything like a proper science of information, right? You need a Claude Shannon or an Alan Turing to plant a flag in the ground right here and say, all right, can everyone see this? Even if you don't quite know what I'm up to, you all have to come over here to make some progress. And there are hundreds of topics where that's the case. So we barely have a purchase on making anything like discernible intellectual progress in any generation. And yeah, Max Tegmark makes this point. He's one of the few people who does in physics. If you just take the truth of evolution seriously, right, and realize that there's nothing about us that has evolved to understand reality perfectly. I mean, we're just not that kind of ape, right? There's been no evolutionary pressure along those lines. So we are making do with tools that were designed for fights with sticks and rocks, right? And it's amazing we can do as much as we can. I mean, you and I are just sitting here on the back of having received an mRNA vaccine. Yes. That has certainly changed our life, given what the last year was like, and it's going to change the world if rumors of coming miracles are borne out. I mean, it's now seems likely we have a vaccine coming for malaria, right, which has been killing millions of people a year for as long as we've been alive. I think it's down to like 800,000 people a year now because we've spread so many bed nets around, but it was like 2.5 million people every year. It's amazing what we can do, but yeah, if in fact the answer at the back of the Book of Nature is you understand 0.1% of what there is to understand, and half of what you think you understand is wrong, that would not surprise me at all.
It is funny to look at our evolutionary history, even back to chimps. I'm pretty sure even chimps thought they understood the world well. So at every point in that timeline of evolutionary development throughout human history, there's a sense like there's no more. You hear this message over and over. There's no more things to be invented.
About 100 years ago, there's a famous story. I forget which physicist told it, but there were physicists telling their undergraduate students not to go to get graduate degrees in physics because basically all the problems had been solved. And this is like around 1915 or so.
Yeah. No, I mean that constant striving for understanding yet another lower layer of the simulation we're living in is something that's actually deeply fulfilling. That I don't know if it's genetically built in, but there's something about that striving to understand that seems to be deeply human.
It's funny. What makes us human? We don't talk about the soul anymore, man. I went to Catholic school as a kid. And whether you buy into all that stuff or not, you're like, what about the soul of a person, the spirit of a people, the spirit of a nation, anywhere, the spirit of humanity? We talk about everything like it's this quantifiable thing when maybe certain things are, maybe everything is. But then what happens if there's things that just aren't quantifiable? that nothing in our understanding can or will ever explain. And that doesn't mean that should be our assumption. It should be our assumption that we can explain everything and let's get to the dang bottom, peel. But what if there is actually something that we need challenge for?
Yeah.
And we could be looking in the wrong place by going, where is it in the genes? Maybe it is. I'm not saying we're looking in the wrong place. Like I wouldn't know anything. I do karate, but basically, not even well. Yeah, we do karate mediocre. Just ask Raymond Daniels or Stephen Thompson. But I guess to come back though, are
you a yellow belt yet, or are you?
Man, I actually have. You ever see the Seinfeld episode where Kramer fights the kids? Yeah, I did that at Raymond Daniels School under the kids won in class, as in addition to the alleyway.
Oh,
yeah.
they finished it off afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. When I was on my last legs, but yeah, I would just maybe. It's funny. I feel like there's something deeply missing from public understanding anymore. That it's almost like the idea that we can figure everything out, which I deeply believe in, but also the possibility that there's some things that we'll never really see and some things we'll never understand. And there's something, like you said, uniquely human about the human experience that even if I had the power to change, I don't want to fuck with it, man. I don't want to change that thing. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, wouldn't it be great if we just immediately knew the outcome of everything and you just press this button, you're like, that's going to, what's the point of living life then? Even if you could do it. It's the Ian, you've seen Jurassic, well, I'll leave you be, sorry, I know what I'm talking about. Ian Malcolm, Jurassic Park, Jeff Goldblum, right? Life finds a way. But we were so concerned with whether or not we could, we didn't stop to think whether or not we should. Maybe?
I think there's it's a deeply human thing, but it's also a really useful thing to always kind of assume that there's this giant thing that you don't understand. So you can forever be striving to understand, because that process gives you meaning, but also keeps making you better. Like thinking that, actually even just thinking that you can't understand everything will lead you to stop too early. So like, I think there's something to, whether it's the soul or whether it's like religious stuff, like assuming that there's this thing that you cannot possibly understand is a really good assumption under which to operate and under which to do this first principles kind of thinking, because you can just keep digging and keep digging and keep digging, even when it seems like you're at the bottom, because you don't fucking know if you're at the bottom or not.
And back to your original, back to one of our, I guess, our other kind of tangents was that comes back to everyone's a human being. The smartest human being in the history of humanity is so hilariously weak, like short-lived and not intelligent.
Speak for yourself, bro.
I understand. I didn't say, no, I'm not saying comparison to me. In comparison to me, everyone is awesome. But that's why I don't do the goat thing. But basically, it's just on a cosmic level. Can you imagine, even if you were a vampire, you're like 900 years old, like how much you would seem like a lowercase g god to people.
Yeah.
You'd be like, how could you know so much? How can you have such a long view perspective? It would be insane. So, I mean, that it seems like we're talking about AI now, right? Where we're creating things that are infinitely smarter than us effectively and live all this time. And it's probably going to do what we tell it to do, right?
No, it's probably, well, I hope it keeps us. So you've talked about humans as special. How exactly are we special relative to the dinosaurs?
So I mentioned that there's, this dramatic cognitive improvement that we've made. But I think it goes much deeper than that. So if you look at a lion attacking a gazelle in the middle of the Serengeti, the lion is smelling the molecules in the environment. Its hormones and neuroreceptors are sort of getting it ready for impulse. Mm-hmm. The target is constantly looking around and sensing. I've actually been in Kenya and I've kind of seen the hunt. Yes. So I've kind of seen the sort of game of waiting. And the mitochondria in the muscles of the lion are basically ready for, jumping. Mm-hmm. They're expending an enormous amount of energy. The grass, as it's flowing, is constantly transforming solar energy into chloroplasts, through the chloroplast into energy, which eventually feeds the gazelle and eventually feeds the lions and so on and so forth. So as humans, we experience all of that. But the lion only experiences one layer. The mitochondria in its body are only experiencing one layer. The chloroplasts are only experiencing one layer. The photoreceptors and the smell receptors and the chemical receptors, like the lion always attacks against the wind so that it's not smelled. Like all of these things are one layer at a time. And we humans somehow perceive the whole stack. So going back to software infrastructure and hardware infrastructure, if you design a computer, you basically have a physical layer that you start with. And then on top of that physical layer, you have, the electrical layer. And on top of the electrical layer, you have basically gates and logic and an assembly layer. And on top of the assembly layer, you have your, higher order, higher level programming. And on top of that, you have your deep learning routine, etc. And on top of that, you eventually build a cognitive system that's smart. I want you to now picture this cognitive system becoming not just self-aware, but also becoming aware of the hardware that it's made of and the atoms that it's made of, and so on and so forth. So it's as if your AI system, and there's this beautiful scene in 2001 Odyssey of Space, where Hal, after Dave starts disconnecting him, is starting to sing a song about daisies, etc. And Hal is basically saying, Dave, I'm losing my mind. I can feel I'm losing my mind. It's just so beautiful. This concept of self-awareness, of knowing that the hardware is no longer there, is amazing. And in the same way, humans who have had accidents are aware that they've had accidents. So there's this self-awareness of AI that is, this beautiful concept about, sort of the eventual cognitive leap to self-awareness. But imagine now the AI system actually breaking through these layers and saying, wait a minute, I think I can design a slightly better hardware to get me functioning better. And that's what basically humans are doing. So if you look at our reasoning layer, it's built on top of a cognitive layer. And the reasoning layer we share with AI. It's kind of cool. Like there is another thing on the planet that can integrate equations and it's man-made, but we share computation with them. We share this cognitive layer of playing chess. We're not alone anymore. We're not the only thing on the planet that plays chess. Now we have AI that also plays chess.
But in some sense, that particular organism, AI as it is now, only operates in that layer.
Exactly. And then most animals operate in the sort of cognitive layer that we're all experiencing. A bat is doing this incredible integration of signals, but it's not aware of it. It's basically constantly sending echolocation waves, and it's receiving them back. And multiple bats in the same cave are operating at slightly different frequencies and with slightly different pulses, and they're all sensing objects, and they're doing motion planning in their cognitive hardware, but they're not even aware of all of that. All they know is that they have a 3D view of space around them, just like any gazelle walking through, the desert. And any baby looking around is aware of things without doing the math of how am I processing all of these visual information, etc. You're just aware of the layer that you live in. I think if you look at this, at humanity, we've basically managed through our cognitive layer, through our perception layer, through our senses layer, through our multi-organ layer, through our genetic layer, through our molecular layer, through our atomic layer, through our quantum layer, through even the very fabric of the space-time continuum, unite all of that cognitively. So as we're watching that scene in the Serengeti, we as scientists, we as educated humans, we as, anyone who's finished high school are aware of all of this beauty of all of these different layers interplaying together. And I think that's something very unique in perhaps not just the galaxy, but maybe even the cosmos. This species that has managed to, in space, cross through these layers from the enormous to the infinitesimally small. And that's what I love about particle physics, the fact that it actually unites everything.
The very small and the very big.
The very small and the very big. It's only through the very big that the very small gets formed. Right. Like basically every atom of gold results from the fusion that happened of, increasingly large particles before that explosion that then disperses it through the cosmos. And it's only through understanding the very large that we understand the very small, and vice versa. And that's in space. Then there's the time direction. As you are watching the Kilimanjaro mountain, you can kind of look back through time to when that volcano was exploding and, growing out of the tectonic forces. As you drive through Death Valley, you see these mountains on their side and these layers of history exposed. We are aware of the eons that have happened on Earth and the tectonic movements on Earth the same way that we're aware of the Big Bang and the early evolution of the cosmos, and we can also see forward in time as to where the universe is heading. We can see Apophis in 2068 coming over, looking ahead in time. I mean, that would be magician stuff, in ancient times. So what I love about humanity and its role in the universe is that, if there's a God watching, he's like, finally, somebody figured it out. I've been building all these beautiful things and somebody can appreciate it.
And figured me out from God's perspective, meaning like become aware of, So it's kind of interesting. So to think of the world in this way as layers, and us humans are able to convert those layers into ideas that you can then combine. Right. So we're doing some kind of conversion.
Exactly. And last time you asked me about whether we live in a simulation, for example. I mean, realize that we are living in a simulation. We are. The reality that we're in, without any sort of person programming this, is a simulation. Like basically what happens inside your skull. There's this integration of sensory inputs, which are translated into perceptory signals, which are then translated into a conceptual model of the world around you. And that exercise is happening seamlessly. And yet, if you think about sort of, again, this whole simulation and Neo analogy, you can think of the reality that we live in as a matrix, as the matrix. But we've actually broken through the matrix. We've actually traversed the layers. We didn't have to take a pill. Like we didn't, Morpheus didn't have to show up to basically give us the blue pill or the red pill. We were able to sufficiently evolve cognitively through the hardware explosion and sufficiently evolve scientifically through the software explosion to basically get at breaking through the matrix, realizing that we live in a matrix and realizing that we are this thing in there. And yet that thing in there has a consciousness that lives through all these layers. And I think we're the only species, we're the only thing that we even can think of that has actually done that, has sort of permeated space and time, scales and layers of abstraction, plowing through them and realizing what we're really, really made of. And the next frontier is, of course, cognition. So we understand so much of the cosmos, so much of the stuff around us, but the stuff inside here, finding the basis for the soul, finding the basis for the ego, for the self-awareness. When does the spark happen that basically sort of makes you? I mean, that's, really the next frontier. So in terms of these peeling off layers of complexity, somewhere between the cognitive layer and the reasoning layer or the computational layer, there's still some stuff to be figured out there. And I think that's the final frontier of sort of completing our journey through that matrix.
And maybe duplicating it in other versions of ourselves through AI, which is another very exciting. So unfortunately, I can't talk to Stanley Kubrick. So I'm really fortunate to get a chance to talk to you. Do you, on this particular notion, I'd like to ask it in a bunch of different ways, and we'll explore in different ways, but do you ever consider human imagination, your imagination, as a window into a possible future, and that what you're doing, you're putting that imagination on paper as a writer and then on screen as a director, and that plants the seeds in the minds of millions of future and current scientists. And so your imagination, you putting it down, actually makes it as a reality. So it's almost like a first step of the scientific method. Like you imagining what's possible in your new series with Ex Machina is actually inspiring, thousands of 12-year-olds, millions of scientists, and actually creating the future you've imagined?
Well, all I could say is that from my point of view, it's almost exactly the reverse, because I see that pretty much everything I do is a reaction to what scientists are doing. I'm an interested layperson, right. And I feel, this individual, I feel that the most interesting area that humans are involved in is science. I think art is very, very interesting, but the most interesting is science. And science is in a weird place because maybe around the time Newton was alive, if a very, very interested layperson said to themselves, I want to really understand what Newton is saying about the way the world works, with a few years of dedicated thinking, they would be able to understand the sort of principles he was laying out. And I don't think that's true anymore. I think that's stopped being true now. So I'm a pretty smart guy. And if I said to myself, I want to really, really understand what is currently the state of quantum mechanics or string theory or any of the sort of branching areas of it, I wouldn't be able to. I'd be intellectually incapable of doing it because to work in those fields at the moment is a bit like being an athlete. I suspect you need to start when you're 12, and if you start in your mid-20s, start trying to understand it in your mid-20s, then you're just never going to catch up. That's the way it feels to me. So what I do is I try to make myself open. So the people that you're implying maybe I would influence, to me, it's exactly the other way around. These people are strongly influencing me. I'm thinking they're doing something fascinating. I'm concentrating and working as hard as I can to try and understand the implications of what they say. And in some ways, often what I'm trying to do is disseminate their ideas into a means by which it can enter a public conversation. So Ex Machina contains lots of name checks, all sorts of existing thought experiments, Shadows on, Plato's Cave and Mary in the Black and White Room, and all sorts of different long-standing thought processes about sentience or consciousness or subjectivity or gender or whatever it happens to be. And then I'm trying to marshal that into a narrative to say, look, this stuff is interesting and it's also relevant. And this is my best shot at it. So I'm the one being influenced in my construction.
That's fascinating. Of course, you would say that because you're not even aware of your own. That's probably what Kubrick would say too, right? Is in describing why HAL 9000 is created the way HAL 9000 is created, is you're just studying but the reality when the specifics of the knowledge passes through your imagination, I would argue that you're incorrect in thinking that you're just disseminating knowledge, that the very act of your imagination consuming that science, it creates something, it creates the next step, potentially creates the next step. I certainly think that's true with 2001: A Space Odyssey. I think at its best, I mean, if it fails,
it's true of that. Yeah, it's true of that. Definitely.
Yeah. At its best, it plants something. It's hard to describe, but it inspires the next generation. So that's very interesting. I think this is a good way to set the table for discussion of objectivism. Is let me at least challenge a thought experiment, which is I don't know if you're familiar with Donald Hoffman's work about reality. So his idea is that our perception is just an interface to reality.
So Donald Hoffman is the guy at UC Irvine?
Yeah.
Yes, I've met Donald and I've seen his video. And look, Donald has not invented anything new. This goes back to ancient philosophy.
So let me just state in case people aren't familiar. I mean, it's a fascinating thought experiment to me. like of out of the box thinking, perhaps literally, is that there's a gap between the world as we perceive it and the world as it actually exists. And I think that's, for the philosophy of objectivism, is a really important gap to close. So can you maybe at least try to entertain the idea that there is more to reality than our minds can perceive?
Well, I don't understand what more means, right? Of course, there's more to reality than what our senses perceive. That is, for example, I don't know, certain elements have radiation, right? Uranium has radiation. I can't perceive radiation. The beauty of human reason is I can through experimentation discover the phenomena of radiation, then actually measure radiation, and I don't worry about it. I can't perceive the world the way a bat perceives the world, and I might not be able to see certain things but I can. We've created radar, so we understand how a bat perceives the world, and I can mimic it through a radar screen and create images like the bat, its consciousness somehow perceives it, right? So the beauty of human reason is our capacity to understand the world beyond what our senses give us directly. At the end, everything comes in through our senses, but we can understand things that our senses don't provide us. But what he's doing is he's doing something very different. He is saying what our senses provides us might have nothing to do with the reality out there. That is just a random, arbitrary, nonsensical statement. And he actually has a whole evolutionary explanation for it. He runs some simulations. The simulations seem, I mean, I'm not an expert in this field, but they seem silly to me. They don't seem to reflect. And look, all he's doing is taking Immanuel Kant's philosophy, which articulated exactly the same cause, and he's giving it a veneer of evolutionary ideas. I'm not an expert on evolution, and I'm not an expert on epistemology, which is what this is. So to me, as a semi-layman, it doesn't make any sense. And I'm actually, I have this Yaron Brook show. I don't know if I'm allowed to pitch it, but I've got this Yaron Brook show on.
First of all, let me pause
on YouTube.
I'm a huge fan of the Yaron Brook show. I listen to it very often. As a small aside, the cool thing about reason, which you practice, is you have a systematic way of thinking through basically anything.
Yes.
And that's so fun to listen to. I mean, it's rare that I think there's flaws in your logic, but even then it's fun because I'm like disagreeing with the screen when I'm
and it's great when somebody disagrees with me and they give good arguments because that makes it challenging.
Anyway, sorry.
So one of the shows I want to do in the next few weeks is bring one of my philosopher friends to discuss the video that Hoffman, where he presents his theory, because it surprises me how seductive it is. And it seems to be so, first of all, completely counterintuitive, but because, somehow we managed to cross the road and not get hit by the car. And if our senses do not provide us any information about what's actually going on in reality, how do we do that? And not to mention build computers, not to mention fly to the moon and actually land on the moon. And if reality is not giving us information about the moon, if our senses are not giving us information about the moon, how did we get there? And where did we go? Maybe we didn't go anyway. It's nonsensical to me, and it's a very bad place philosophically, because it basically says there is no objective standard for anything. Mm-hmm. There is no objective reality. You can come up with anything. You could argue anything, and there's no methodology, right? I believe that at the end of the day, what reason allows us to do is provides us with a methodology for truth. And at the end of the day, for every claim that I make, I should be able to boil it down to see.
Yeah.
Look, the evidence of the senses is right there. And once you take that away, knowledge is gone and truth is gone. And that opens it up to, complete disaster.
So, to me, why it's compelling to at least entertain this idea. First of all, it shakes up the mind a little bit to force you to go back to first principles and ask the question, what do I really know? And the second part of that I really enjoy is it's a reminder that we know very little, to be a little bit more humble. So if reality doesn't exist at all, before you start thinking about it, I think it's a really nice wake-up call to think, wait a minute. I don't really know much about this universe. That humbleness. I think something I'd like to ask you about in terms of reason, when you can become very confident in your ability to understand the world if you practice reason often. And I feel like it can lead you astray because you can start to think so I love psychology, and psychologists have this certainty about understanding the human condition, which is undeserved. Yeah. You run a study with 50 people and you think you can understand the source of all these psychiatric disorders, all these kinds of things. And that's similar kind of trouble I feel like you can get into with when you overreach with reason.
So I don't think there is such a thing as overreaching with reason, but there are bad applications of reason. They're bad uses of reason or the pretense of using reason. I think a lot of these psychological studies are pretense of using reason, and these psychologists have never really taken a serious stat class or a serious econometrics class, so they use statistics in weird ways that just don't make any sense. And that's that's not reason, right? Yeah. That's just bad thinking, right? So I don't think you can do too much good thinking. And that's what reason is. It's good thinking. And now, the fact that you try to use reason does not guarantee you won't make mistakes. It doesn't guarantee you won't be wrong. It doesn't guarantee you won't go down a rabbit hole and completely get it wrong. But it does give you the only existing mechanism to fix it.
Right.
Which is going back to reality, going back to facts, going back to reason. And getting out of the rabbit hole and getting back to reality. So I agree with you that it's interesting to think about these, what I consider crazy ideas, because what is my argument about them? If I don't really have a good argument about them, then do I know what I know? So in that sense, it's always nice to be challenged and pushed and oriented. The nice thing about objectivism is everybody's doing that to me all the time, right? Because nobody agrees with me on anything. So I'm constantly being challenged, whether it's by Hoffman on metaphysics and epistemology, right? On the very foundations of my knowledge. In ethics, everybody constantly. And in politics all the time. So I find that it's part of, I prefer that everybody, there's a sense in which I prefer that everybody agreed with me, right? Because I think we live in a better world. But there's a sense in which that disagreement makes it, at least up to a point, makes it interesting and challenging and forces you to be able to rethink or to confirm your own thinking and to challenge that thinking.
What philosopher or philosophical idea had a big impact on your life, not just in the space of cryptocurrency, but in general?
Oh, so we're going now. We're rolling.
We're going right in.
We're rolling.
Because you majored philosophy.
I did. I majored in philosophy. I didn't know what to do with my life, and my parents said, do whatever you find interesting. It's like, okay, philosophy, great. Find that interesting.
Yeah.
And it had way more of an impact on my career, actually, than I thought it might. Typically, I guess if you do philosophy, you go into law or finance, so it sort of makes sense. But there are a number of philosophers I really admire. One of my favorites would be Descartes, probably, the notion of skepticism. It's sort of a rabbit hole. It's kind of hard to pull yourself out of it. Basically, the brain in the vat theory, pulling yourself out of that. But yeah, I really like epistemology, questioning what it is to have knowledge. So Descartes was one of my gateways to that.
Do you think everything is knowable? Like we humans can know fully the objective reality?
Oh, definitely not. No, I mean, reality is very much processed through your own, subjective lens.
So how much do you think do we understand about this world? Because a lot of your ideas, a lot of things we might talk about today are kind of trying to figure out human civilization, how human behavior works at scale, all those kinds of things. That kind of assumes that we have it or we're able to somehow figure most of it out, right? So in your sort of, when you step way back, how much of it have we really figured out?
Well, I think that's the conceit of economics, is thinking that you can model human behavior
right
in these unbelievably complex systems. And then I think that's the modern critique of economics, like the sort of Talebian critique, is that you can't have true knowledge, and they're much less predictable than we think they are. And, we behave according to our accumulated assumptions, and we're using tiny sort of data sets trained on the last 50, 100 years, and they turn out to be horribly askew. And that's when we have our gray swans and our black swans. So I'm much more on the sort of, reality is much less knowable than we think side of things.
You're considered the founding father of virtual reality. Do you think we will one day spend most or all of our lives in virtual reality worlds?
I have always found the very most valuable moment in virtual reality to be the moment when you take off the headset and your senses are refreshed and you perceive physicality afresh, as if you were a newborn baby, but with a little more experience. So you can really notice just how incredibly strange and delicate and peculiar and impossible the real world is.
So the magic is, and perhaps forever will be, in the physical world.
Well, that's my take on it. That's just me. I mean, I think I don't get to tell everybody else how to think or how to experience virtual reality. And at this point, there have been multiple generations of younger people who've come along and liberated me from having to worry about these things. But I should say also, even in I called it mixed reality back in the day, and these days it's called augmented reality. But with something like a HoloLens, even then, like, one of my favorite things is to augment a forest, not because I think the forest needs augmentation, but when you look at the augmentation next to a real tree, the real tree just pops out as being astounding. It's interactive. It's changing slightly all the time if you pay attention. And it's hard to pay attention to that, but when you compare it to virtual reality, all of a sudden you do. And even in practical applications, my favorite early application of virtual reality, which we prototyped going back to the 80s when I was working with Dr. Joe Rosen at Stanford Med near where we are now, we made the first surgical simulator. And to go from the fake anatomy of the simulation, which is incredibly valuable for many things, for designing procedures, for training, for all kinds of things, then to go to the real person, boy, it's really something. Like, surgeons really get woken up by that transition. It's very cool. So I think the transition is actually more valuable than the simulation.
That's fascinating. I never really thought about that. It's almost, it's like traveling elsewhere in the physical space can help you appreciate how much you value your home once you return.
Well, that's how I take it. I mean, once again, people have different attitudes towards it. All are welcome.
What do you think is the difference between the virtual world and the physical meat space world that you are still drawn, for you personally, still drawn to the physical world? Like, there clearly then is a distinction. Is there some fundamental distinction, or is it the peculiarities of the current set of technology?
In terms of the kind of virtual reality that we have now, it's made of software, and software is terrible stuff.
Yeah.
Software is always the slave of its own history, its own legacy. It's always infinitely arbitrarily messy and arbitrary. Working with it brings out a certain kind of nerdy personality in people, or at least in me, which I'm not that fond of. And there are all kinds of things about software I don't like. And so that's different from the physical world. It's not something we understand, as you just pointed out. On the other hand, I'm a little mystified when people ask me, well, do you think the universe is a computer? And I have to say, well, I mean, what on earth could you possibly mean if you say it isn't a computer? If it isn't a computer, it wouldn't follow principles consistently, and it wouldn't be intelligible, because what else is a computer ultimately? I mean, and we have physics, we have technology, so we can do technology, so we can program it. So, I mean, of course, it's some kind of computer, but I think trying to understand it as a Turing machine is probably a foolish approach.